What's up guys, this is your favorite fanfic YouTuber, the Fanfic Majesty, and welcome to another amazing video. You can follow me on Patreon for exclusive stories. 17 et. Chapter 550th Carelessness. Advertisement. Monk. Coulson came out of the restaurant and saw Monk happily chatting with a woman on the street, he exclaimed enviously. Monk glanced back, said goodbye to the girl, and walked over to Coulson. Coulson looked at Monk's face. What's wrong? Meng Xuan asked. Lipstick, Coulson pointed out. Monk wiped it off carelessly, and said with a smile, I can't help it, the people here are too hospitable. Have you completed your mission? Nothing strange there. Coulson nodded first, and then said, It's nothing, a photo and some documents, what can be unusual? Let's go have a drink. Monk looked at the nearby nightclubs. Coulson coughed lightly and said, Are you treating me? Are you treating me? Monk looked at Coulson. Coulson, I only work part-time, and I only have a fixed salary every month, and I don't even have a raise, which is insignificant. Monk waved his hand and said, Come on, I'll treat you. Coulson smiled and said, Thank you then. Monk put his arms around Coulson's shoulders, and was just about to speak, when suddenly his hands became cold, goosebumps fell all over the floor, and his heart was so sweet. Monk took a step forward, looking at his hands. What's going on here? This feeling is very bad. What's wrong? Coulson asked. Monk looked at Coulson and said, Are you feeling sick? No. Coulson looked at Monk in surprise, and said, You won't retreat, will you? Hey, Monk grinned and said contemptuously, It's up to you, how much can you drink? Let's go. After saying this, they walked into the nightclub quickly. No sooner had they pulled the door towards them than the blaring music and noise poured out of it, and they both staggered to their feet before walking in, grinning. After ordering drinks, Monk and Coulson took their seats at the booths on the deck, watching the excited crowd on the dance floor, infected by the atmosphere here, and couldn't wait to dance. Monk poured himself a glass of wine and took a sip, while Coulson filled his glass and came to the dance floor to join the crowd. Looking at Coulson's back, Monk smiled. This guy is gone. He looks tasteless and doesn't look like an agent at all. Advertisement. However, as an agent, does one have to sacrifice one's gender in certain situations? Coulson wouldn't be that kind of guy, would he? But look at Coulson. Tisk tisk, he shouldn't be able to do such a task. Monk put down his wine glass with a smile, and saw his hands with a strange expression on his face. The feeling just now was very strange, which gave him a very bad premonition. Maybe not. There's really something in this box, isn't there? Thinking of this, Monk's eyes widened, and a card appeared in his hand. Name. Byakuya Kuchiki Byakuya Kuchiki. Character introduction. Captain of the 6th Division of the 13th Division of the Shinigami Guard. Remarks. Handsome and unrestrained. If there really is something invisible. The dots of light in Monk's hand flew away. A handsome man. A grim expression. A figure holding a Zanpakuto appeared behind Monk and rushed into Monk's body like a dot of light. Due to the dim light, the flashing water vapor behind Monk was not noticed. The corners of Monk's mouth rose slightly, because he felt the pressure of spirit flooding his body. Wouldn't it be nice if he could manifest the Grandmaster Blade again? Would he be able to bring out the full power of this character? But right now, it's clearly not necessary. Was his gaze flickering slightly? Looking at Coulson in the crowd, he gasped. I saw a white shadow with long black hair standing behind Coulson with his head lowered, one hand lightly pressed on Coulson's shoulder. What? The other hand is holding 10 people wearing white bibs, pale child. At that moment, both of them moved with Coulson. If you only look at Shiro. Monk may not recognize her. Plus that baby. Monk recognized each other at a glance. Gamago, Saki 10. What happened to these two people? Monk's mouth twitched. But don't they only haunt those who enter the rooms they lived in during their lifetime? How did he come across the ocean to get here? Does this mean something to do with the box? What the hell is going on here? A series of questions flashed through Monk's mind, and then a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and he looked at Coulson, who was dancing face to face with a beautiful woman. Tonight's good show seems to be on the horizon. Etc. Coulson's theorem. When you meet Coulson during your travels, something unexpected will happen. So what happened on the plane is nothing. Advertisement. This is the main thing. 0 for flowers. He was careless. He didn't blink. The corner of Monk's mouth twitched slightly at the thought of letting Gamma take Coulson away like this. Hey, number 1. At this time, a tall, alluring woman walked to the card table next to Monk and looked at him with interest. Monk turned to look at the woman, and smiled at her. A few minutes later, Coulson walked up to them and sighed. He was rejected. At this time, he saw Monk talking and laughing happily with that woman, and he became even more depressed. After a while, you slept with someone else. He admits that Monk looks better than him, but the difference is not that big. Hi. The woman greets Coulson with her arms around Monk. Coulson raised his hand, squinted at Monk and said, That's fast. 0. With a puzzled look on his face, Coulson raised his glass to touch Monk's. Monk smiled, his gaze flickered behind Coulson's back, and then turned into a force disappearing disorder. The mother and son were still standing behind Coulson, but they got closer. Cheers. The woman cheered, looked at Monk, drank it in one gulp, leaned over and blew in Monk's ear, and said in a low voice, I feel dizzy, I think I drank too much. Monk smiled and said, Sorry, not tonight. Coulson didn't let him have any fun, and he set out to create a family of 3 with Gamma Coco. He is not a cold man who just looks but doesn't do anything. How about watching Coulson's worldview collapse with a smile? Hearing these words, the woman staggered back, pushed Monk hard, snorted softly, turned and left. Coulson looked at this scene with a puzzled expression on his face. Monk, you. Alas. Monk sighed, how could I leave you alone? Coulson raised his glass and said, no drinking. Monk smiled, clinked glasses, and the two quickly shared the wine. After drinking, both of them were slightly drunk and returned to the hotel they booked. The 2 rooms were next to each other on the left and right, so they opened the door, said goodnight to each other, and walked in. As soon as the door was closed, a card appeared in Monk's hand. As soon as the purification technique was used, his mind immediately cleared up. Monk squeezed his chin, used the second card to obtain the mental scanning ability, then closed his eyes, and groped towards the opposite room. Advertisement. Chapter 550th 7 Small Lethality. Advertisement. As a SHIELD agent, you must never let your cognition be limited. What atheist? This is a world where anything can happen. This time, Monk finds himself on the other side. What will happen next time? So today Monk will ask Mr. Gamma Coconut to teach Coulson a good lesson, break this cognitive limitation, firmly remember what happened today, and have a long memory. If similar things happen in the future, he will not let him. Your own mind loses its guard. However, seeing Coulson's worldview collapsed when he saw the senior's expression, I still find it funny. Of course, this is just a casual statement, absolutely accurate, and absolutely a casual statement. Mental scanning. Monk controlled his mental power to carefully observe what happened in another part of the room. Since Teacher Puzi is considered to be one of the inheritors of the ghost world and is powerful, it is impossible for him to be caught in 493. However, he obviously underestimated the strength and capacity of Teacher Puzi. Teacher Gamma quickly noticed the spiritual power of observation, and just looked at Monk's room with a look that I remember you, I will look for you after a while. This made Monk a little nervous. Long black hair hanging down, pale face, hurt eyes. Reminiscing about the shocking flicks by the teacher just now. The atmosphere immediately changed. Monk swallowed, took out a bag of potato chips from the second pocket and gave them to Charles, put a piece in his mouth, and watched the live broadcast. That night, Coulson drank a lot of alcohol. On the way to the hotel, the alcohol did not drop, but kept rising, making him dizzy. Rubbing his head, watching strands of hair appearing on his fingertips, Coulson took a breath, and then threw it into the trash can helplessly. Why is it so cold? Coulson froze for a moment, glanced at the thermometer in the room, confusion appeared in his eyes, and then his eyes became cloudy. What do I want to do? Coulson shook his head, wrinkled his nose, casually threw the black cloth-covered box beside the bed, shook the black cloth on his body, walked to the bathroom, and said, take a shower, and then go to bed. Quote. After taking a shower, Coulson made himself comfortable in the bathtub. It's finally not cold. When a person takes a bath after drinking, the alcohol in the blood will rise faster. After a while, Coulson felt that the whole world began to spin. It wasn't a good feeling, so he picked up a wet towel and covered his face. Just before he put the towel over his face, 2 figures appeared beside the bathtub. Advertisement. Toshio Saki stood by the bathtub, looking at Coulson calmly. Mr. Gamago stood in front of Coulson's head, looked at Coulson's face covered with a towel, and then slowly leaned over. Watching this scene, Monk nervously stuffed 2 chips into himself, but Coulson didn't feel anything. In the end, Teacher Gamma's face was close to Coulson's, but Coulson, who was covered with a towel, still didn't feel anything. Gamma made a series of punches. She can easily straighten Coulson now, but if she does, she always feels that something is missing. By the way, that was extreme panic, accompanied by screaming. When she saw them, the hatred and resentment overflowing in her heart suddenly broke out. Now, the other guy didn't see her at all, so be careful. So, she turned her head gloomily and winked at her son. Toshio Saki obediently reached for the towel, and just as he was about to touch it, Coulson ripped it off, and then wrestled with the bent jockeyzy. Time stood still at that moment, and the atmosphere became unprepared, which made Monk, who had been watching the broadcast, tense up. With an angry expression, Kako raised his hand and grabbed Coulson. The drunken Coulson stared blankly, but the towel in his hand was deftly stuffed into his hand by Kayako. He spat into the bathtub, and muttered, "Press it." Teacher Jai seemed to have never encountered such a situation before, so he froze in place. Ha ha ha. Monk laughed until the potato chips fell apart. This may be the most embarrassing moment for Teacher Jai since he practiced for so many years. Toshio Saki looked at Kayako cautiously, and grabbed Coulson's neck with both hands. Pushing away his son's hand, Judge said he had to come in person this time. The towel in his hand was twisted by an invisible force and turned into a cloth stick. Ticking network. A drop of water fell on Coulson's back, causing him to look up suspiciously. And the moment he raised his head, Jamazi grabbed the towel and stuffed it directly into Coulson's mouth, stretching his mouth to the limit, and rushed towards his stomach. Coulson's eyes widened immediately, and he grabbed the towel hard and pulled it out 10. Looking at this scene, Teacher Jai finally felt some satisfaction in her heart, but she obviously didn't want Coulson to die in vain. She wanted Coulson to experience the horror of ultimate. Advertisement. As soon as Coulson took out the towel, his stomach rolled and turned into a human-shaped fountain in an instant. Vomit. Something unspeakable splashed on Gamma Cox. The atmosphere instantly became heavy and awkward. Toshio Saki took 2 steps back in fright, and the black-haired Kayako began to dance, obviously irritated to the extreme. Ha 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 ha. Monk, the only audience member, was already scratching his stomach with laughter. This is simply the Waterloo of Teacher Puzi's career. He was so drunk, the alcohol was out of his head. 1.7, he didn't even realize what had just happened, but the agent's instinct told him that his life was in danger, and the danger came directly from this woman standing in front of him. The next second, seeing Shuizi and Toshio Saki enter the door, he fired without hesitation. He slammed open the bathroom door, staggered out, turned and ran outside, dodged behind the bed, and grabbed the gun. But that strand of black hair wrapped around his body without him noticing, throwing him to the ground. The bullet punched a hole in the door. Is he a murderer? Kayako and the two disappeared before his eyes. He carelessly pushed the towel aside, wrapped it around his body, shook his blurred head, looked at the muddy Kayako, frowned trying to wake up his alcohol-drowned head. Who are you? Coulson shook his head, and suddenly felt a light itch on his neck. Something is not right. Coulson watched this scene, his confused expression made him wake up, and he retreated to the bathroom door. Boom. Such spittle stars cleared his mind a lot. Coulson turned his head, looked at Gamma, and met his eyes for the first time. One hand grasped a strand of hair that he envied. He narrowed his eyes and lunged forward. Coulson wiped his mouth and staggered out of the bathtub. The power of resentment surging in Kayako's body made her tremble all over. The bathtub under her feet burst with a bang, and the faucet began to spray water crazily, washing away the filth all over her body under her conscious control. Advertisement. Chapter 558. The smelly face on the table. Advertisement. What face is that? It is obviously clean, but there is hatred and resentment inside, resentment towards oneself, resentment towards others, resentment towards the whole world, and the eyes are full of endless anger. She was going to kill him, kill everyone. As soon as Coulson saw the other party, a wave of resentment enveloped him, making him seem to have seen the most terrifying thing in the world. His eyes narrowed, then he took a sharp breath and stepped back. But the strands of long hair tied him tighter and tighter. He was locked in place, only endless terror loomed over him. Gamma Coco will let Coulson experience all the horrors before she dies, and she will scare Coulson to death when she is alive. Coulson's face was pale, his eyes lost focus, and cold sweat broke out all over his body. He had been sucked in by the illusion created by the Gamma Coconut. Seeing this scene, Monk finally took a step. When he ate the last piece of potato chips, a card in his hand dissipated, and the moment Kuchiki Shikui turned into a light spot and rushed into Monk's body, Monk materialized again as Senbon Sakura, and then his body flashed, using the teleportation card instantly moved to the opposite room. At 10 the moment he appeared, 2 pairs of eyes were looking at him. Poco, Toshio Saki. The mother and son looked at Monk, silent, but an invisible resentment was quietly surging into Monk's heart. Monk's body trembled due to the release of mental pressure, suppressing the irrepressible resentment. He took a step towards Kayako. Let him go. Gamma stared at Monk, a more terrifying resentment bursting into substance. Monk raised his eyebrows, flicked the kitchen knife in his hand, and the clear track of the sun flashed in the distance. After the hair on Coulson's body was cut off, Monk grabbed Coulson and dodged to the side instantly. The hair rushed towards him like a black waterfall. But those overwhelming black hairs didn't intend to stop. After a brief pause, they spread across the room at a faster speed. Monk waved the knife in his hand, cut off the tangled hair, and shook Coulson awake. Seeing that Coulson's head was in a daze, whether it was a hallucination or a state of drunkenness, he cast a purification technique on him. In an instant, Coulson's eyes widened, and he woke up from the nightmare. As he gazed at the world in front of him, he yelled, "Dot! What the hell is that? What hair is that?" Monk said. Jealous. That hair, Coulson said nervously. This is not the time for such jokes. Advertisement. Black hair surrounded them like a tide, flooding half the room. Don't leave my side, Monk said softly. The knife in his hand slammed into his back violently. With a crisp sound, the ghostly figure quietly appearing behind them was penetrated by the helicopter, turning into black hair and falling to the ground. Monk raised an eyebrow. It is a pleasure to play with the skill of this Garin. In the next second, Jalons appeared silently on the black hair, crawling towards them in various strange postures, and the black hair on the ground strangled their necks like giant pythons. Spread out, Senbon Sakura. With Monk's whisper, the Zanpakuto in his hand shattered like pieces of scarlet sakura flowers and flew towards Sora. In the terrifying room shrouded in darkness, a different kind of light appeared. It is beautiful. Gamma pondered for a moment, then became righteously indignant. Damn them all. Such beauty should not be destroyed. But the first to be ruined was her cascading black hair, which put many to shame. Where the scarlet sakura flowers flew over, all the hair broke out, and the long hair on the two of Monk was cleaned up in one fell swoop. Gamma let out a disoriented scream as all the doppelgangers rushed towards the two monks. However, a fluttering of sakura flowers blocked all the doppelgangers, tearing them apart and surrounding the Gamma coconuts, thus protecting the monk. During this process, Coulson noticed Monk whispering something next to him. Just as he was thinking, he heard Monk yelling in a low voice, "Six light prison." In the next moment, the Six Paths light staff suddenly appeared around Kayako, restraining him. Kayako resisted fiercely. Toshio Saki uttered a chilling cry, and rushed to his mother. Goodbye. With Monk's whisper, the scarlet flowers flooded the Kalen. Seconds later, as all the petals dissipate and disappear, so does the black hair in the room, and everything becomes an illusion. Kayako hugs his child like a ghost, as if it will dissipate at any time. Monk swung his knife, and the two disappeared. Seeing this scene, Coulson breathed a sigh of relief. It's finally over. Advertisement. It's over. Monk squinted at Coulson and said, it's not over yet. What? Coulson turned around in a circle, looking for traces of Gamma Coco, with an undisguised fear on his face. Gamma Coco's hallucinations had tripped him up, and he didn't want to do it again. Monk walked to the bed, looked at the box wrapped in black cloth and said, if you don't destroy this thing, it will appear again. If he guessed correctly, that box contained Gamma coconuts, the roots of Gamma coconuts. It looks like Kayako's house, which has become a cursed place where Kayako collects grudges and kills anyone who enters there. The same goes for this box. Whoever opens it will die. Monk guessed that some powerful mage moved Gamma Coco's spell location from the room to the box. 740. As long as the box is still there, the Gamma will appear again. Destroy. Monk was at a loss for words, and said, although you are shameless, you look a lot like that D********** D Nick Fury. Monk slammed his fist on the box, and the box fell back with a bang. At the moment of falling back, screams of anger and despair sounded in the ears of both of them, and then gradually. You shield are really stinky sentries. Monk said softly. Dispelling the power of the avatar, Monk turned to Coulson, smiled and said, so, an atheist. This thing is a curse, whoever opens it will die, it is useless, although it can be used to stab some people in the back, but if you are not careful, you will hurt your own people. Monk held his breath. Coulson had no expression on his face, as if he was not talking about himself. All in all, more harm than good. Please, sir. Never mind. Coulson asked suspiciously. No. Coulson shook his head confidently. I'm not dead, this thing is a dud, I want him to spit out the money. Coulson muttered to himself and said decisively, then destroy it. Monk said, hey, S.H.I.E.L.D. spent a lot of money this time, and it turned out to be nothing. What atheists? Are there any? He saw that the resentment on the box had completely disappeared. Advertisement. Chapter 559. Time flies. Advertisement. While Monk and teacher Jamazi were fighting wits and courage, the three Clark brothers far away in the suburbs of New York were also brewing their own money-making plans. For them, it is not difficult to make money, the most important thing is not to break the law. After some discussion, they came up with an interesting idea. They spent the whole day preparing to go to New York to make money together tomorrow. Due to a supernatural event in their school, the whole school had to be on summer vacation, but students from other schools continued to attend classes, and their target was the high school students who attended this school, more precisely, a private noble school of high school students. Eric has been busy all day today, and Charles will be busy tomorrow. As for Clark, he is just a bodyguard driver in the plan. Early the next morning, the three of them set off for New York City with 2 backpacks on their backs, and the destination was Santa Fiacal School. The next thing they have to do is to deliver things to the school gate after school. The things that were given to him were trinkets made by Eric himself with discarded metals, not very expensive, but very beautiful, especially able to attract the attention of girls and cause kawaii screams. Of course, to get what was sent, they had to play a game called Guess Your Love Mind, with Charles. With Charles's ability, he can definitely guess right. This is just the beginning, and the next step is the highlight, which is the payment link. When the minds of the people who come to play this game are guessed, most people will participate in this question out of curiosity, and the next thing is Charles playing his own tricks. No, it's time to use your rich experience. He will tailor effective quotations for customers and charge as much as possible for individual items. They also have a more advanced service, which is to help customers who are in love with someone or want to pursue someone, and become, guess, the idea of customers pursuing their goals. For example, what do you like, what do you dislike? At such an age, it is easy to overflow with love in the mouth. In order to keep up with the footsteps of the beloved and bring happiness to the lover, these noble high school students who are not short of money at all can spend a lot of money. At first, people who played the game were just happy to buy Charles's services, but then demand simply fell short. In just 3 days, the three of them earned enough travel money, which was a huge sum of money. After earning enough money, the three came to a restaurant to celebrate. Haha, we succeeded, it was so easy, backquote. Charles smiled smugly, an eyebrow almost flying out of his features. Eric said politely, you have the most credit this time, Charles. Advertisement. Hey, Charles said with a smile. It's better if your jewelry is well done. If there is no attractive jewelry, there will be no sequel. It's up to you. No, it's your fault. Seeing the two people flattering each other in a commercial manner, Clark fell silent and tapped the table with his fingers. Both of them were silent, they tacitly raised the juice in their hands, and said to Clark, it's all brother's fault. Clark nodded in satisfaction, grinned and said, eat something, then find me. Eat something, then find a hotel to stay in, tomorrow you can leave directly from New York. When leaving in the morning, they locked the door. For those who chase after love. For our trip. For this collaboration. Cheers. All three nodded approvingly, touched the cups lightly, and grinned. Why, you've already set off for a trip. Monk leaned on the chaise longue, listened to the laughter of the three boys talking on the phone, snorted in surprise, and then asked with a straight face, where did the money come from? Oh, Charles sighed, I'm so clever. Eric's expression changed, and he said, we earned it well. Monk muttered, Clark. Clark coughed lightly and replied, yes. Oh, Monk asked curiously, then how did you earn it? I'll tell you. Eric picked up the phone and told Monk the whole story. Monk was silent for a few seconds after listening, and then said, you can feed me later. Hearing this, he sighed, hung up the phone, but a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. These three children always caught him off guard. Advertisement. Still, that's really not a bad thing. Monk smiled happily, slipped the sunglasses off his face, took a sip of his drink, and walked slowly forward on the soft sand. The next day, Coulson returned to S.H.I.E.L.D. to continue working. With no one in the way, Monk can finally get to work. Look, there is a sea ahead, full of mermaids. 1.5 months later, Monk, who had fished for a month and cast nets for half a month, returned home. After staying at home for 2 days, the three brothers also came back. Clark was admitted to college soon, and during this period, Monk wanted to give Clark a fighting class. Okay, New York is a big place, there are big and small martial arts gyms and martial arts schools. Knowing Monk's plans, Charles and Eric desperately wanted to join him. Kickstarter. He's not alone, but Monk is a little out of sorts. However, he has new powers to increase Clark's combat experience. Half a month later, Clark fulfilled his wish. This time, after packing his bags, he finally left home to go to college. The next day, Monk had nothing to teach. So Monk decided to give Clark some practical guidance. Clark is physically strong, and in the future he will be able to withstand most opponents with his speed and heavy punches, but when facing opponents of the same level, unless he has superb skills, he will be defeated. As long as you want, you can always find a suitable partner. Because Eric and Charles are starting school too. The days became boring and ordinary again, but there was one less person in the family, and Charles and Eric grew up, and the family became quieter and quieter. But a day later, they were played by Clark. Monk was also very depressed about this, and he did mutter a few words about Clark's learning ability. Clark's learning ability is very poor, everything can be mastered by memorizing it temporarily. As the days passed and Charles and Eric left for college to finish their studies, Monk was left alone at home. So from the moment Monk made his decision, New York City was wary of kickers. Despite Monk's insistence that he didn't need a escort, he drove him to school, then back to New York after 2 days in Boston with Charles. Advertisement. Chapter 560 Time is AB*************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************** It tends to slip away when no one is looking, and one by one, the children move on to the next phase of life before Monk is ready. Elementary school, middle school, university. Later, some children became adults. After Clark graduated from university, he stayed with Monk at home for a month and then started wandering. When his student life is over, he finds himself at a loss, doesn't know what to do next, and doesn't know why he came to this planet, so he embarks on a journey to find himself and his future. Monk knows some things about Clark, such as where Clark came from, how Krypton was formed, how the spaceship at the South Pole. But he hesitated, and still didn't tell Clark directly. Clark not only needs the answers to these questions, but also needs to go through the process of searching, no longer confused and doubt himself, so as to grow. The process is far more important than the answer. Besides, if Monk told Clark now, Clark would immediately go to Antarctica to find the Kryptonian ship. If you activate the Kryptonian spaceship, does it invite the Kryptonians in like in the original show? What's next? In Clark's state at the time, he was totally unprepared. So Monk gave up. Following in Clark's footsteps, Eric and Charles graduated, earning PhD degrees, and more than one, even though it took an extra 373 years or so to study. Fast forward to the early winter of 2007. The early winter weather has started to get cold. Monk stood up, took out his phone, and looked at the date with a smile. Tomorrow, 2 boys, Eric and Charles, will come back. As for Clark, the vagabonds have kept in touch with each other for many years. He has come back twice, each time staying at home for a month, but the return date is uncertain. Walking to the kitchen, Monk made himself a simple breakfast, then watched the news, sat by the window with a cup of coffee, and the early winter sun shone on him, making him feel relieved. As the children grow up and achieve certain achievements, Monk's ability has also been improved. When Clark was in his second year of college, his ability was finally upgraded to IV4. When he reached level IV3, he got an epic boost, and when he reached level IV4, Monk got a legendary boost. After thinking for a while, Meng turned on the system. Host. Monk. Advertisement. Novice gift. Assassin time. Skill. Memory Fantasy Avatar. Memory Fantasy Avatar. Upgrade BAFB rewards. 1. The Chest of Eternity. 2. Sublime Pocket. 3. Blood of Krypton. Current ability level. IV4. Current upgrade progress. 42. 42. Sun. Clark Kent Kryptonian. Clark Kent Kryptonian. Sun. Eric Kent Mutant. Awakened. Eric Kent Mutant. Awakened. Sun. Charles Kent Mutant. Awakened. When reaching level 2, Monk gains the permanent item, Case of Eternity, as well as the ability to materialize skills. When reaching level 3, Monk gains the permanent skill, Pocket of the Sublime, as well as the ability to fully materialize the character's abilities. Yes, the Kryptonian bloodline, a bloodline that does not need to be materialized but is permanently powerful, can continue to grow as long as it is exposed to the sun. The strange thing is that what he thought he got was the permanent ability of human beings, but what he got was uniformity. However, Kryptonian bloodlines and abilities mean nothing to him, and even bloodlines are much better than abilities, because bloodlines have the potential to grow. Bathed in the sun, his strength continued to increase, and Monk felt the thrill of insisting on upgrading. After the IV-4 upgrade, his materialization ability did not increase. On the contrary, the total amount of materialization power in his body increased sharply. Even at IV-4, each upgrade progress increased by 1. His expressive power will also increase a lot. From items, skills, abilities, to the ever-increasing manifestation of power, it all combined to give Monk a strange feeling. It's like he's got it all before, like he's preparing to be able to do it later. The only way to know what abilities will come later is to wait for an update. But how updated is it now? Hello. Monk decided to get some more sunshine by himself. The sun was very comfortable. Monk yawned and fell asleep slowly. Because of the Kryptonian blood flowing, Monk is getting stronger every day, and even his age seems to be no longer increasing, except for the gray hair on the temples, and the wrinkles that appeared before have completely disappeared. Monk thought to himself that, to say the least, he was just like a young man. Advertisement. Monk was awakened by the door opening. Thief. It's impossible for an old father like him who lives alone to have a thief come in, right? Instead of using his clairvoyance, Monk got up and walked towards him. No one knew that Kryptonian blood flowed through his body, and he usually didn't use this ability very much, but carefully hid it. When he thought back to the pain he experienced when he first awakened to superpowers, he realized how intense and difficult that pain was for Clark as a young boy at the time. Dad! Quote exclamation mark quote. He covered Monk's face with his hands, and muttered to himself, strange, where are the wrinkles? You didn't run out for plastic surgery, did you? Monk laughed and said, I'll make you whatever you want to eat. They washed their hands, put away their luggage, and walked into the kitchen to help Monk, talking about the interesting things they encountered, and the father and son burst into laughter from time to time. As time goes by, the originally cold house gradually becomes alive. Ha ha. As he spoke, he walked towards her. Dumpling. The father and son acted quickly, and at 12 o'clock, the hot dumplings came out of the pan. Snapped. Shaking off Charles's hand, Monk said out of breath, still so ungrateful. Ha ha. Dad, I want to eat your cooking. Charles put down his luggage expectantly, but looked at Monk carefully, and asked strangely, Dad, why do you look young again? Charles giggled and grabbed Monk's shoulders and said, Are we father and son? Eric put his arms around Monk and explained with a smile, I hurried back after finishing the report today. Whatever. The father and son are sitting in the living room, each with their own plate of dumplings, and the white wine brought by Jay Oro in a small plate prepared by Jay Oro, watching TV. They've been talking about it for a while. Monk walked to the kitchen as he said that. Staring at the two handsome boys standing at the door, Monk was taken aback for a moment, then with a smile on his face, he said in surprise, Why are you back? Are you coming back tomorrow? Advertisement. Chapter 561st Means. Advertisement. Nick Fury's words stunned both Eric and Charles. Especially Charles. Ever since they told Nick Fury the plan, he has been using his ability to silently invade Nick Fury's brain, silently observing the interlocutor's mental activities. During the conversation, the interlocutor's series of he knows more about psychological changes than Nick Fury himself. To his surprise, the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. trusted his father. Camouflage. Under his power, all pretense becomes a joke. Monk looked at Nick Fury and said, Is that why you trust me? Ha ha. Nick Fury laughed and said, Isn't it touching? Monk quipped. You don't look like a top secret agent at all. Nick Fury leaned back on the chair and said calmly, First, I understand you. Second, if this plan succeeds, it will bring great benefits to the world. I participated in order to let us control this plan together. After a pause, he looked at the father and son with a smile and said, The most important thing is, even if I don't participate, you must carry out the plan. Monk nodded and said, Yes. Tisk. Nick Fury frowned, drank the long cold water in the glass in one gulp, turned his head and said to Monk, You have already decided, if I don't agree, or you find out that I pretended to agree, you just erase the memory directly. Monk is very capable and he knows very well that Monk can do it. Hearing this, both Eric and Charles became nervous. Instead Monk looked at Nick Fury and said, That's not accurate. If so, you'd be farther than me. Nick Fury spread his hands. I'm just an ordinary person, I can't compare with you. He has no superpowers, and often can only use some methods cautiously, but even so, he also realizes that in the face of absolute power, any conspiracy is vulnerable, and in his mind, Monk is superpowers one of them. Although he didn't know the abilities of Eric and Charles, but thinking of the abilities of Monk and Clark, he instinctively felt that the abilities of those two people must also be exaggerated. What abilities do they both have? You'll find out soon. Before Eric and Charles could speak, Monk gagged each other with words. Nick Fury looked at Monk slyly and said, So what if you tell me in advance? I won't tell you. What am I going to tell you? Can you set aside some of the money to build the school? Nick Fury mutters. S.H.I.E.L.D. better stay out of the way. Monk looked at Nick Fury disdainfully and said, Don't pretend you don't understand, I'm talking about you, not S.H.I.E.L.D. Since you want to participate in this project, is it really enough to come empty-handed? Advertisement. I have money in me. Nick Fury exclaimed. I still have to support my family. Don't think I don't know what you're doing. Monk grinned and said, now you're secretly translating. Nice. I agree. Nick Fury stared at Monk through gritted teeth and said, you're such a jerk. Monk grinned and said, friend of a friend. Seeing the two people bargaining, Eric and Charles were at a loss for a moment, and when they heard that Monk had just typed out the money for him, he was overjoyed and said to Nick Fury, thank you so much, Uncle Fury. Quote. Don't call me uncle, call me Fury. Nick Fury said angrily. Every one of your family is full of dirty things. You call me uncle. I don't know when you sold me. Monk replied honestly. You talk like I can't sell you unless I call you uncle. Nick Fury took a breath and said, come on, tell me what you can do. Monk looked at Nick Fury threateningly and said, if you don't pay back the money later, don't blame me. Nick Fury snorted and looked at Eric and Charles. The two looked at Monk again, and Monk nodded to them and told him about their abilities. Once the plan starts, their abilities cannot be hidden at all, and it doesn't matter if Nick Fury finds out sooner or later. Hearing the abilities of these two people, Nick Fury widened his eyes, glanced at the father and son, and took a deep breath. This home is simply a devil. If this family wants to destroy the world, for him who has been constipated for so long, is it easier than going to the toilet? Speaking of this, he couldn't help laughing. Luckily, he and Monk are friends. Wait a moment. If Monk is strong, why are his 3 children also so strong? All 3 children, he realized, were adopted by Monk. Could it be that the children adopted by Monk also get 0 looking for flowers? He couldn't help but look at Monk, wondering if it was too late for him to do so. Monk's hair stood on end when he saw him, and asked, what do you want to do? Nick Fury sneered. I think. Monk retorted. Even if it's what you want. Advertisement. Nick Fury shrugged, and finally came back to his senses, and the messy thoughts in his mind disappeared. Silence. After a few seconds, Monk couldn't help but said, it's done, you can go, what are you waiting for? Nick Fury jumped up, pointed out the corner of his eye to the gradually darkening sky outside the window and said, you still drive me away so late. You don't even stay for dinner. Now that the funds have been allocated, what do you want to eat? Spicy chicken. Monk waved his hand and walked towards the kitchen. Watching Monk leave, Nick Fury smiled. Eric couldn't help laughing out loud, and said hastily, I'm going to help in the kitchen. Nick Fury's mouth tightened as he said, you look a lot like your father. Ha ha. Turning his head, he looked at the two, and before he could speak, Charles asked, Fury, what's the matter with your eyes? It's all so hateful. Ahem. Charles coughed slightly and said, I won't say it. Charles happily accepted the compliment. Nick Fury. Nick Fury glanced at Charles, and the atmosphere became more awkward. 3. He looked curiously at Nick Fury's single eye, which was covered by a blindfold. Thanks. Charles and Eric looked at each other, and an evil smile flashed in their eyes. I told you about my ability just now, so you should know that I can see through lies or something at a glance, right? Eric said disapprovingly. It's a small problem, and my father should be able to fix it. Nick Fury muttered. I lost it on a mission, and that's a lesson for me. No matter how thick-skinned he is, he has a bit of a fever now. Nick Fury's face twitched wildly. Oh, Nick Fury nodded regretfully. He wanted to cure me, but I refused, and I want to remind myself to remember this lesson. That's the next thing. He wants to talk to Eric and both. Advertisement. Chapter 562 I have money. Advertisement. The awkward atmosphere lasted until the end of the dinner. Nick Fury put on a leather cloak and walked out of Monk's house, but just as he opened the door, a gust of cold wind blew in, and he couldn't help shivering. Turning around, he waved to the father and son who came to see him off and said, Goodbye, keep in touch. Goodbye, keep in touch. Charles and Eric nodded. Charles didn't want to embarrass Nick Fury, but he knew that Nick Fury wanted to ask about their situation, so he deliberately said it out, directly interrupting the interlocutor's thoughts of chatting. Etc. Monk turned to Nick Fury, held up his hand, pulled a box from his vice pocket, and said, This is for you. Nick Fury took it over. A smile quickly slipped from the corner of his mouth, and said coldly, What the hell is this? I'll put it down right away. Whatever you say. After Monk finished speaking, he pushed open the door and walked into the room with Charles. 427. Watched the 3 of Monk leave his sight. Nick Fury grinned and hurried to his car, then opened the box, took a piece out of it, and put it in his mouth. Crack. Still a familiar taste. Nick Fury made a satisfied expression and drove away. Inside the house, Charles asked curiously, Dad, what is this? Bear cookies. What the hell? Eric asked incredulously. King. The guy likes to eat this stuff, but he can't even pull the trigger because he's the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., so every time I leave, I give him a box. Monk laughs. Charles and Eric looked at each other. Director of S.H.I.E.L.D., cookies. Can anyone link these two things together? Monk went upstairs with a smile and told the 2 of them. Okay, let's find the school's construction address in a few days. Nick Fury. Monk has known him for so many years. In the eyes of his friend Monk, he is still the childish Nick Fury who likes to tease cats, says he is good at cleaning pots and pans, and likes to eat bear biscuits. Maybe it's because Monk is too powerful and doesn't care about Nick Fury's status as director, so he and each other can always get along well, which is why they can be friends for so many years. Hearing what Monk said, both of them nodded, their thoughts still a little scattered. A top secret agent with a soft spot for gummy bears. Both of them were stunned. This is too harsh to say. 3 days later, Staten Island, New York. Advertisement. Right here. Seeing the castle-like building in front of him, Monk's eyes were filled with joy. He liked how the building resembled the ex-academy he remembered. The world has changed, and so has Charles's upbringing, but what seems to belong to him still belongs to him. The castle-like main building, the garden behind, the main road in front, the distant forest, small lake, and even various sports venues. It's so beautiful. The most important thing is that the area should be large enough. Charles and Eric were also very happy, but when they thought of the price of this house, they both sighed helplessly. Too expensive. Neither of them had saved enough taels for the last few figures. The two pulled Monk aside, and Charles stammered, "Well, Dad, Eric and I don't have that much money." "Money is not a problem." Eric's eyes lit up, and he said, "You let Charles use his abilities." Before Monk could answer, Charles frowned and said, "I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that." Monk looked at the two people, puffed up his chest, put on an old father's majestic appearance, and said blankly, "I said, money is not the key." The two looked at Monk suspiciously and asked, "Dad, do you know how much this place is worth? Isn't it more than 1 billion? Monk readily agreed. The two looked at each other in confusion, and Charles couldn't help but say, "Dad, it's 100 million, not 1 million. If it was 1 million, he believed that his father would definitely find it, but now it is 3 billion. Even if his father sold the family's farm and mansion in New York, he would not be able to pay a fraction of the huge sum." Monk smiled mysteriously at the two, waved to the female agent who brought them to the house, and said, "Come on, I bought it. Here, I bought it." The female agent was a little surprised, but her good professional habits prevented her from showing what she shouldn't. They don't look like billionaires from their clothes, but she heard that some rich people have this eccentricity, so she just smiled and said, "Sir, are you sure you want to buy this place?" Monk nodded. The employee of the intermediary company smiled, but was a little flustered. 0. If this order is fulfilled, she will get a sum of money. Unable to restrain the excitement in her heart, she said, "Sir, do I need to give you time to prepare funds?" "Unnecessary," Monk said awkwardly, took out a bank card from his pocket, and handed it over. Advertisement. The intermediary employee took the bank card and said, "Please follow me." Seeing this scene, Charles and Eric couldn't help reaching out to pull Monk. "Dad, don't play tricks. Eric and I know exactly what happened to our family." Eric nodded, looking anxiously at Monk. It is said that old people, old people, the older they are, the more they look like children. He was mentally prepared for this, but the way Monk looks now. It really can't be explained by old children. Wait, that's not Parkinson's. Eric was horrified, watching Monk's eyes become pained, confused and sad. Just as Monk was about to explain to Charles, he was taken aback by Eric's eyes, turned his head to look at him, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "What's that expression? What do you mean, gentlemen?" The employees of the intermediary company shouted in response. Monk simply gave up the idea of explaining to the two, taking it for granted. Let the facts speak for themselves. Half an hour later, Charles blankly signed the sales contract. This feeling is even more shocking than picking up a gun and riding a horse, but suddenly 1.4 finds that you can't do what you want. What's happening here? How did you buy it? Is it really signed in my name? He turned his head to look at Eric, saw that he also looked dazed and shocked, and couldn't help but look at Monk again, and then saw the employee of the agency company take out a note and hand it to Monk, his heart. Hold tight. No, this not pretty woman who looks his age wants to be his mother. Charles coughed slightly and said, "Very well, you can go." Pleasant cooperation, doctor. The agency employee shook Monk's hand, but winked at him. It was rich, richer than she had imagined. Monk waved his hand and said, "See you later." The agency employee squeezed Monk's hand, flicked her palm, turned and walked away under the breathless gaze of Eric and Charles. Advertisement. Chapter 563 Breakfast. Advertisement. Hey, watching the agency employees walk away, Monk grinned and casually threw the note aside. Young people nowadays always like to take shortcuts. Sighing, Monk turned his head and saw that Charles and Eric were looking at him with burning eyes, and couldn't help but pick Taku. "Why are you looking at me like this? Dad, where did you get so much money? Where did you get so much money? After all, Fury's money hasn't arrived yet, right?" Charles now even has a sense of unreality about what happened. Monk. Just happened. He got some money himself, then the White Queen had a lot to thank him for. Howard sent him a huge check and he turned out to be a rich man. Eric couldn't help asking. "Dad, tell me the truth, which country are you the prince of? How old are you? Still have such a naive idea." Monk shattered Eric's illusions. "Dad, I have a very serious question for you," Charles asked, rubbing his hands together. "How much do you have left?" Seeing that Monk bought the manor and didn't take care of it, it doesn't look like he has spent all his money. Monk silently counted and said, "Maybe there are 7 or 8 more places to live." "What?" exclaimed Eric, 7 or 8. Charles scratched his forehead. "Our family is so rich." They looked at each other, and suddenly felt like screaming. Thinking of the toys they couldn't afford when they were young, the two of them frugal to buy food for the two of them, and even remembering that when they were in college, they had to frugal and even work part-time to afford gifts for their girlfriends. They couldn't help but hug their heads, cry bitterly. Is that a lot of money? Monk frowned. It's nowhere near those real billionaires. According to this consumption rate, the money will be spent soon. Both brothers were at a loss. Is this really the mentality of the father? Seeing the expressions of the two, Monk smiled secretly in his heart, then straightened his face, and said seriously, okay, the place to build the school has been bought. When will the enrollment start? When will the action start? When it came to business, the two brothers suppressed the sudden surge of passion. After a moment of silence, Eric said, I'm leaving soon. Eric, Charles murmured, concern in his eyes. Leaving is easy to say, but only when you know what leaving means can you realize the division of this sentence. Let me know before you leave, Monk murmured. Eric nodded and said, I know. Advertisement. College admissions aside, we need a good opportunity. Now is not the time to recruit students, because the school has not yet proved its worth. Rushing to recruit students will only lead to pressure from all sides, and they will be punished by Shen Mi. Monk raised his eyebrows and said, then it might be the Black Queen. The Black Queen is very important in their plans. Both nodded, and Eric said, I'll dive into Hellfire, but I'll need some time to gain their trust, build my prestige, and get rid of suspicion after killing the Black Queen. Charles put his chin on his hands and said, I will wait for your signal, and at the same time, I will look for opportunities to make myself famous. Both of them nodded. Monk looked at his watch and said, okay, all that needs to be said is over, now let's go to fill our stomachs, I have taken a fancy to a nearby restaurant, Eric Kaido. Dad, let's go home, I want to eat what you made. He forced a smile on his face and said, it will be a long time before I can go home. Charles smiled wryly. Monk nodded. A card appeared in his hand, begging for venom. After thinking for a while, it turned into a portal and appeared in front of them. Masters are gone. 3 days later, Monk's home. Early this morning, Eric got up. He put away the things in the room, stood at the door, looked around, closed the door, and walked downstairs. He quietly came to the kitchen, stood there recalling for a while, fiddled with it for a while, and then began to prepare. Monk's room. When he stood up, he heard Eric's voice, and he watched Eric scurrying about in the kitchen with supervision. A smile quickly slipped from the corner of his mouth, then couldn't help biting. Monk held his head in his hands, staring blankly at the ceiling, and scenes flashed before his eyes. Smiling faces of 3 kids running and playing at home. The way he got into trouble at school, the way he averted his eyes when facing him in the teacher's lounge. The funny expression when I called myself daddy for the first time and learned to walk for the first time. Even the scene of meeting the 3 children for the first time is still fresh in his memory. But unconsciously, the 3 children have grown up and even began to choose their own paths in life. Sad, but, as long as they think that they will become talents in the future, they will be happy. Monk forced a smile, followed by a long, lazy sigh. Of course, still very excited. But lying down won't solve anything. Monk got up and washed his face, then walked downstairs. Advertisement. Dad, are you up yet? Eric looked at Monk outside the kitchen and smiled, looking a little nervous. Monk deliberately asked, what are you doing sneakily? Eric shook his head, walked out with 2 breakfasts, and put them in front of Monk nervously. Monk took a look and the result was not bad. So, he has done it many times. 012508410 Filu 220,382,250. He knows exactly what he's talking about. Dad, why don't we try? Eric hands the cutlery to Monk. Monk took a sip and nodded. It tastes good. Eric shook his head and said, just a little embarrassed. Eric frowned. This principle is closely connected. Eric nodded, watching Monk eating breakfast with satisfaction. His heart suddenly ached. Meng 987K nodded slightly, but this made Eric nervous. At this time, Charles came out of the room, looked at the 2 people who were having breakfast, and squeezed out a smile on his face. He walked to the kitchen, brought out the breakfast, sat down opposite them, and ate in silence. Stand up. Monk couldn't help laughing. You little guy, am I really that scared? Monk looked at Eric with some apprehension in his eyes. Is it because he is leaving today? Eric grinned, but the next moment his expression froze. Monk said, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Who asked me to be your father? Go and eat it, it's really delicious. So this certainly isn't the first time. For more than 20 years, he never seemed to have cooked any meal for his father except this one breakfast. So, you cooked breakfast for a lot of girls in college, right? Eric was stunned for a moment, and inspiration came to his mind. He hurriedly said, I just want to try my hand at them. Does Dad look a little upset? Advertisement. Chapter 564th Care. Advertisement. Silent breakfast. Perhaps this is the first time in years that the monks have been so silent at breakfast. After breakfast, Charles immediately put away the dishes on the table and said, I'll do the washing. He wasn't that active when he was doing the dishes, but the current atmosphere is depressing him. Eric slowed down and could only watch as Charles disappeared from sight. Monk stood up and said, follow me. Eric followed obediently, and Monk walked into the living room. Dad, I am. Don't tell me yet. Monk took out a map, used it, and said to Eric, close your eyes. Eric was a little puzzled, but he closed his eyes obediently. Monk looked at Eric's face and rubbed it with his hands. After 3 or 2 minutes, Monk took his hand away and said, okay. Eric was a little puzzled, because Charles came out at this moment, saw Charles's face, and exclaimed, Eric. Huh, what's the matter? Seeing that Charles seemed to have seen something incredible, Eric was a little puzzled. Your face. Face. Remembering that Monk just poked him in the face, Eric had a thought, and he quickly ran into the bathroom, then stared at the strange face in the mirror and froze. Was his face no longer his face? He came out of the bathroom in shock, looked at Monk and said, Dad, what's that? Dad, what's that? Don't worry, you can change back. Monk looked at Eric's face, nodded with satisfaction, and said, after you finish this, you can continue with your life. Eric replied excitedly, thanks, Dad. Charles on the side finally smiled. Seeing this scene, Monk said he didn't stay up all night. Eric, the man's threat, chatted with Monk again, reluctantly but firmly said, Dad, I'm leaving. Dad, I'm leaving. Monk patted Eric on the shoulder and said, if you have any problems you can't solve, you must come to me. Eric replied, giving Monk a little hug, and was about to turn away when Charles said, wait. Wait. After saying this, he turned and ran to his room, and came downstairs a few minutes later, clutching his helmet tightly. Hey Eric, don't forget this. Charles shoves the helmet into Eric's hand. Advertisement. Monk was dumbfounded and said, why does this thing look familiar? Well, Dad, you brought this here. Charles was talking. Seeing Eric looking at him strangely, he coughed unnaturally. I was afraid you would lose it, so I hid it. The corner of Eric's mouth twitched and said, I said I couldn't find the reason, so it was you. Some embarrassment appeared on Charles's face. Seeing Eric staring at him closely, he felt powerless. When he wanted to hide, he was thrown to the ground by Eric. Goodbye, Charles. Charles froze for a moment, just about to speak. Eric repeated, goodbye. After finishing speaking, he slapped him hard on the back a few times, and before he could react, he pushed him away forcefully, and said with a smile on his lips, I'm leaving, Dad, don't send me off. As soon as the voice fell, he walked away quickly. Charles glared at Eric and yelled, you wait. However, when his interlocutor opened the door and disappeared from sight, the anger on his face instantly disappeared like spring snow melting. He kept a depressed and concerned expression, and said to Monk, Dad, I'm going back to my room. Before Monk could answer, he rushed up the stairs. Well, Monk sighed and shook his head. This path is their own choice. As a father, he cannot stop them, nor can he do it for them. The only thing he can do is to support them and help them realize this wish. The next day, Charles also left the house. Plans are already starting to take shape for the brothers, who will have very little contact with their families from now on. The three fathers and sons knew why. The house was empty again. Monk walked out of the room and stood in the sun, squinting his eyes, enduring the glare of the sun. This guy named Clark didn't expect to call me. I don't know how he is now. Monk scratched his hair in annoyance, and suddenly flew into the sky, disappearing in no time. The next day, New York, Hell's Kitchen, in an unassuming hotel. Eric sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the helmet lying on the side, his hands clenched uncertainly, and the helmet flew into his hand. He quietly groped for the helmet, his eyes flashed, the helmet in his hand began to twist and deform under his control, and then it seemed as if a pair of invisible hands were kneading and crushing, the helmet turned into small particles, floating in front of him go. The reason why the helmet can block telepathy is not because of the helmet itself, but because it is made of special materials. Eric grinned, and the materials that flew into his palm began to reassemble the helmet under his control. Tuck tuck. Advertisement. There was a knock on the door, and the helmet held in Eric's hand instantly returned to its original shape and fell on his bed. Before he could open the door, Eric burst into the room at gunpoint. Oops. He looked at each other and smiled. He heard that the neighborhood is very messy, and even the police are reluctant to come here to patrol, but he didn't expect to encounter such a thing. It's such a blessing. He flipped over. Be honest. Give back all your money. The man looked at Eric angrily. Eric grinned. There's no future in robbery like this. Stop it. Get the money out quickly, or I'll shoot you. Eric grinned and said, then shoot. Damn, you think I dare not? A fierce light flashed in the man's eyes. It was not the first time he had killed someone. Roll. This is Hell's Kitchen. His brother is the leader of the gang. The gunshot rang out, but the blood hole he expected did not appear on Eric's head, and even the smile on Eric's face did not change at all. Boom. Eric stretched out his hand to hold the bullet, and smiled at the predator. This is the first bullet fired at me, it is very commemorative. He had never seen such an arrogant person. You. The robbers froze Qian Li's. But in the next second, the gun flew out of his hand and aimed at his head. The man was taken aback, but quickly raised his gun. Eric cursed in displeasure, and swung his arm violently. The hovering gun hit the man's chest, knocking him out of the way. Eric took a step back in horror as the muzzle moved away from his head. The bullet stopped right in front of Eric's head. He still couldn't break free. You are courting death. Under the gaze of the other party, Eric slowly held the other party's hand holding the gun, raised it above his head and said, come on, shoot. Come on, Tian Chang. He snarled and actually pulled the trigger. As time goes by, the bullets fired at him will loosen more and more. Advertisement. Chapter 565. Their respective actions. Advertisement. Eric closed the door helplessly. His hands were still soft. Although he realized that the person he was talking to was not a good person at the moment of shooting, and his hands were probably already covered with blood, he still didn't attack him. It is difficult to be the first to strike first. However, he realized that since he had embarked on this path, he would take this step sooner or later. although he still set a lower limit for himself not to kill innocent people indiscriminately. After a few minutes, he waved his hand, picked up the helmet from the bed, checked it, and walked out the door with the helmet. Walking to the door of the inn, he frowned. I saw that the person who was chased away by him just now was curled up in front of his chest, staring at him angrily, and beside him stood a person who was 3 times his size but much older than him. Behind them, there were more than 20 people with unkind faces standing. Brother, that's him. It's a monster. The man looked at Eric threateningly, with killing intent in his eyes. But the elder brother did not speak. A fierce light flashed in his eyes, and he said lightly, kill him. If he dared to hit his brother's idea, even if the opponent was a monster, he would shoot him and beat him into a sieve. Can you block bullets? Hee. Let's see how many bullets you can block. The man looked at Eric with a sneer, and roared arrogantly. But he apparently doesn't know anything about Power 270. Da 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 da. Gunshots rang out, and bullets rained down on Eric. Eric was expressionless, with only a hint of irritation in his eyes. Why did this man come to die? The bullet, stopping in front of Eric, went up. Seeing this scene, fear gradually appeared in the hearts of the people who were originally laughing. When they saw the densely packed bullets fired and stopped in front of Eric like a wall, the gunshots stopped unconsciously. They swallowed heavily, turned around and ran away without thinking. Eric clenched his fists and watched these people go further and further away. At this moment, perhaps sensing that there was no movement behind him, the man who robbed Eric took a step forward, turned around and wanted to shoot Eric again. Advertisement. Eric's eyes narrowed, and his heart, which was still slightly hesitating, instantly became cold. He loosened his clenched fist, and with a wave of his hand, all the bullets that stopped in front of him flew out. Blood splattered, and screams were heard endlessly. Eric watched from the sidelines and began to get used to it. When all the sounds subsided, he raised the helmet he was holding tightly above his head and flew into the sky. When countless pairs of terrified eyes hidden on both sides of the street were watching him, he quickly disappeared. Hank, I need your help. Charles put the coffee aside, looked at the neat-looking man wearing glasses standing in front of him, and said softly. It was Hank, but Charles's classmate, Hank McCoy. The other party is also a mutant, a friend he met at school, and they can communicate with each other. Hank McCoy was silent for a moment before saying, You really decided? It's decided. Charles said with a slight smile, the place is also ready. A trace of curiosity flashed in Hank McCoy's eyes, moving so fast. Want to go and have a look? Charles invited, see where it doesn't fit. Hank McCoy looked up his glasses and said, Okay. So, you promise. I'll take a look and think about it. Charles shrugged and raised his hand to pay the bill. He knew the man well enough to know that what he said meant he agreed. Hank McCoy was a research genius in his high school. When he learned that the other party was a mutant, he quickly chatted and became friends, because they are both mutants. The other party only knew part of his and Eric's plan. As for Eric's part, he didn't tell the other party, and the other party didn't know Eric either. Because Eric and he are not college classmates, so his professors and classmates do not know that he has a brother Eric, and even because he intends to remain anonymous, no one knows his family situation. The two left the cafe and drove Charles's car to the yet-to-be-named Baffa estate. When he came to the manor, Charles welcomed Hank McCoy in, looked at the surprised expression on the interlocutor's face with satisfaction, and asked, How is it? Very good. Hank McCoy raised his glasses and said, Looks like you're really serious. That's for sure. Would I lie to you? Advertisement. He smiled and patted his interlocutor on the shoulder. Hank McCoy grinned and said, I don't know what cheating is. I don't know if you can cheat, but I know you cheated a lot of girls. Quote. Charles blushed without heartbeat, and said in a steady voice, This is your love. Hank McCoy shook his head with a smile, turned his head and looked at the building behind him, with little stars in his eyes and said, Mutant school, if you are a mutant. Mutant school, if you need it, I join. Ha. Charles laughed happily, putting his arms around his companion's neck and said, I knew you would agree. Hank McCoy sighed, with the corners of his mouth slightly raised, and said, I always thought you were up for grabs. 21. Ha ha. Charles laughed loudly. To commemorate your joining, let's have a drink. Wait a minute. Hank McCoy suddenly thought of the most important question. So, how many people are there? Me and you. Is it too late to quit now? What do you say? In the vast desert under the scorching sun, a figure was walking slowly, seemingly not caring about the terrifying temperature at all. In fact, he didn't care, and was even comfortable. He has been walking in this desert for a long time, but he has never had a goal, he just counts where he goes. Over the years, he has traveled all over the world, seen a lot, experienced a lot, and left many unforgettable photos with the camera he carried with him. His eyes wandered over the sand dunes, searching for traces of oases in the distance. Just as he discovered the sand dunes, he saw a man being pulled into the quicksand. Without thinking about it, he disappeared in place as soon as his body moved. When the man was about to despair, he casually snatched the man from his arms and threw him to a safe place. Clark's movements were quick, so fast that the man's desperation had barely dissipated before he was safe. The man froze, knelt on the ground and began to pray. And Clark had already fled to the distance. He smiled weakly, and continued to walk to the distance. He no longer knows how many people he saved during his wanderings. I don't know what happened to Dad and the others, he said. But if Dad's here, they should be fine. Clark smiled, thinking of his family. He has not been in touch for a while, and he will call to inquire about the situation after this matter is over. Advertisement. Chapter 566. Still not used to it. Advertisement. Eric flew high in the sky, looking down at the people coming and going. His eyes gradually became firm, he sighed silently, and quickly lowered himself to the shore below. It's not the first time he's done something like this, but he's still not used to it. The Black Queen's men have been hiding recently, and Eric has been unable to find each other's traces, but now he has a stupid but simple way. Do things and let the other person come to you. The Hellfire Club of the Black Queen is currying favor with the mutants. Although he has demonstrated his fighting power, and even properly expressed his hatred for humans and approval of the Black Queen's actions, he believes that the Hellfire Club will not let him go. Such a powerful fighter. Eric fell from the sky in front of the crowd, attracting cheers of admiration. He didn't care, just walked to the door of the bank. The bank guard saw him falling from the sky and said stiffly, "Sir, as you wish." Eric raised his head, and an invisible force pulled the guard back. He hit the wall and passed out. Seeing this scene, other bank guards immediately took out the money, and everyone who came to the bank was stunned. Eric raised his hand, aimed a whirlwind at his gun, and took away the owner of the gun. The alarm bell rang, but Eric ignored it and walked calmly to the counter. Seeing this scene, people ran out screaming. Eric waved his hand, and the abandoned guard was brought up by the metal on his body. He looked at him, smiled faintly, and said, "Is the vault there?" The guard looked at Eric in horror, trembling all over, and stammered, "Over there, over there." He pointed in the right direction. Eric put the other man on the ground, straightened his hat, and said, "Thank you. Thank you." After saying this, he walked towards the vault. At this moment, there was a shrill siren outside. Eric turned around, and turned to look at the entrance of the bank. When he saw the policeman trotting in and pointing a gun at him, he sneered, shook his finger and said, "Don't point a gun at me, I'm nervous." As he spoke, he raised his hand, and when the policemen watched in horror what happened before them, the guns in their hands broke free, and the barrels were aimed at the original owners. Eric smiled weakly and said, "Look, you're a little nervous too. What do you want to do?" The captain plucked up the courage to ask Eric. "Ah," Eric said, turning to the vault, just trying to do something nice as the Black Queen. As soon as the words fell, he waved his arm, and the weapon slammed into the owner of the weapon, leading them away from the bank, and then grabbed Eric. The police car parked at the door was directly dented, and then flew towards the bank gate, closing the bank. Eric walked slowly towards the vault, but he couldn't stop thinking about what to do for a while so that what happened today would make the headlines tomorrow and how to get people's attention. Advertisement. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. That's it. He reached out and groped for the safe, with the corners of his mouth slightly raised. Vaults made of steel plates and concrete were his favorites. The area of the vault is small, only about 200 square feet. He aimed at the vault with his hand and squeezed it tightly. Bang bang. The ground shook, and the entire vault was pulled out in one go, like a box pulled out by hand, and the bank staff were stunned. In the next second, Eric slowly soared into the air, flew towards the door of the bank, stretched out a pair of arms towards the door of the bank, punched a hole in the door of the bank blocked by a police car, and flew out the whole person. And the moment he flew out, the sniper rifles ambushing around him each fired a bullet. But these bullets were not of much use. When they flew towards him, they had deviated from the trajectory and flew in all directions. Eric hovered over the assembled crowd, smiling haughtily on a sunny face and saying, "Ready to party." As soon as he finished speaking, he made a pulling gesture with his palm backwards, and the vault he pulled out of the bank trembled on the spot, and amidst screams of horror, rolled from the bank gate to the street and rose into the air in the midst of people's unbelievable gazes. They finally landed at Eric's feet. What does he want? The police watched this scene in horror, put down their guns, and gave up their plans on the matter. What's the joke? Let them use those crappy little guns against such a monster. Are these Secret Service agents really crazy? He couldn't help it, and seeing Walter and Eric climbing higher and higher, he whispered, "Hurry up, hurry up. 0 for flowers. Do you think he's going to break your stuff?" At this time, the colleague next to him suddenly spoke. He felt his brain snap, and his heart was instantly shrouded in a shadow. But in fact, Eric had no such intention. He's just trying to get attention, he's not a killer. His real purpose is advertisement. Wow. One wall of the vault was separated from him, and with a slight movement of his hand, the cash box flew out. He grinned, and money rained down from the sky. Ha ha ha. Accompanied by unscrupulous laughter, money was spilled, people looked up at the sky, their eyes were full of shock, and then went crazy. At this moment, everything around seemed to freeze, only endless madness occupied the whole world. 0. New York City Police Headquarters. Snapped. The newspaper was thrown on the table by the police chief, and Eric picked up the headline as a matter of course, with several pictures under the headline. Money pouring down, crowds frenzied, Eric is flying in the sky. This smacks of bullying. The chief of police gasped, glared at the crowd, and said, "Look at this. What are you eating? Who is this guy? What the hell is he going to do? Someone tell me." Others in the office looked around tremblingly, bowed their heads in silence. They don't know anything. He's crazy. That mutant is crazy. Even though he has dealt with criminals for so many years, he has never seen such a big criminal. But looking at the picture, the other party's arrogant gesture of flying into the sky with the force of the sky, he was not only angry, but also shocked in his heart. Why is it such a horrible upgraded criminal again? How does this make them cops? There was silence in the office. The police chief took a deep breath and said, "Everyone gather, wait for this mutant to appear, and arrest him immediately." "Director, don't we ask SHIELD for help? Have you got water in your head?" The chief of police grabbed the other party by the collar and muttered, "Do you think our police station is not incompetent enough now?" The man smiled sarcastically. The principal let go of the other party's collar and angrily said to the crowd, "Get out of here. Get out of here." Advertisement. Chapter 567 Fangirl. Advertisement. Compared with the bad mood of the New York Police Department Commissioner, Nick Fury is in a much better mood now. He put the newspaper in his hand, walked to the window with a smile on his face, and looked happily at the lake outside the SHIELD headquarters. Although he was mentally prepared for Eric's ability, he was still taken aback when he saw the report. Even so, it's not the whole history of this kid. He muttered to himself, completely trusting his hunch. Immediately, a kind of happiness welled up in his heart. They are a gang. They're way more reliable than this SHIELD crap. He, Nick Fury, is going to fight for the safety of the whole world, not the G Hydra. He couldn't help cursing when he thought of the hard work he had put in for SHIELD over the years. He took a deep breath, collected his thoughts, and dialed the phone. When the phone rang, he said, "Have you read today's news? 193 inches. Look, it's the mutant. Police. With them. Huh." Nick Fury said with a smile. "Our SHIELD has been paying attention to this matter. Yes, any news about this mutant will be sent to me as soon as possible, and all actions must go through me. The opponent's strength is very strong, so avoid causing heavy casualties." As soon as the voice fell, he hung up the phone, then took out another secret mobile phone, edited the message and sent it to Eric. "SHIELD is about to move. Stay connected and stay safe." Just when Eric was getting ready and Charles was getting ready for school, Monk came to New York with nothing to do. With nothing to do, he came to New York. In fact, he just wanted to be closer to the two kids, even though the distance didn't make any difference to him. Looking at Eric, who made headlines, he couldn't help laughing. This guy is always used to making a lot of noise. I don't know if the plan of these two people has succeeded. Putting the newspaper in his hand, Monk stretched himself and walked out of the house. He had several properties in New York, picked one at random in Manhattan, bought some furniture, and moved in. He doesn't know if he plans to sell the farm. After all, the family is past the age of development. But thinking that Clark was still somewhere outside, even if the farm was delayed by Clark's airship, it had to be temporarily put on hold. Advertisement. Locking the car door, Monk drove the car to the restaurant where he had dined many years ago. When he got to the place and saw that the restaurant was still there, he smiled. Walking into the restaurant, ordering a grilled pork chop and a beer, Monk waited with bated breath for something he hadn't tasted in years. While Monk was waiting, the woman sitting in the corner quietly eating grilled pork chops looked at Monk silently, her eyes full of surprise. At this moment, she saw Monk noticed her, not only did not look away, but looked at Monk more boldly. Monk frowned. He seemed to remember the woman's face, but couldn't pronounce her name. But soon, his attention was attracted by the tonkatsu in front of him. Taking a deep breath, Monk smiled. "The taste is still the same. Cut off a piece and put it in your mouth. It is crispy on the outside and tender on the inside." Monk is deeply satisfied. When the woman saw it, she wiped the butter on the corners of her mouth, walked towards him with wrinkled steps, but made a vigilant expression in front of Monk, and said, "Mr. Kent." Monk said without squinting, "You got the wrong person." "No, I won't admit the wrong person." The woman shook her head and said, "For 10 years, I've come here to wait for you once a week. I'm sure I didn't admit the wrong person." After hearing this, Monk shook his head more firmly and said, "Belle, you found the wrong person. Waited for him for so many years. Maybe he did something wrong to the other party back then. For example, after one night, the other party has BB, or on the contrary, the other party just wants a receiver." Monk Kent, the king of assassins codenamed Ghost Wolf in the League of Assassins, completed a total of 473 missions without a single failure. Finally, he disappeared after killing the leader of the previous generation, the king of assassins, Kutcher. The woman calmly recounted Monk's previous achievements. Monk's facial expression did not change, but the woman felt that Monk's expression changed, becoming murderous, as if there was an invisible knife resting on her neck. There was no resistance at all. The woman's heart tightened in horror. Is this the strongest assassin king of the previous generation? Taking a deep breath, she smiled and continued. In the last year, Monk Kent killed a man named Monk Spederich. Monk was still eating the grilled pork chop slowly, with a smile on the corner of his mouth, as if he was enjoying the delicacy in front of him. Monk Spederich killed a judge and his wife years ago, and that judge was my father. As soon as the words fell, she felt that the murderous aura that made her shudder disappeared. Monk raised his head, chewing a piece of meat, and said, "Are you from the League of Assassins? Point zero." Advertisement. The woman nodded, surprisingly nervous, and said, "Firefox, you can call me a fox." Firefox, Fox. Monk finally met the other's face from his already blurred memory. Monk swallowed the meat in his mouth and said, "So this is your own business? It has nothing to do with the League of Assassins?" "Yes," Firefox replied. Her eyes sparkled, like a member of the troupe saw his idol. In fact, she adores Monk. Ever since she was recruited into the League of Assassins and learned that it was Monk who brought down Monk's Patridge, out of gratitude and curiosity, she has been studying Monk's information and the records of that mission. The more she watched, the more she admired him, and even made following Monk her goal. Ghost Wolf Monk Kent, King of Assassins, her idol. Monk muttered to himself, smiling softly, keep it a secret that I'll see you tonight, okay? Firefox nodded hesitantly. Thank you. Monk continued after thanking, I no longer work for the League of Assassins. Firefox sighed helplessly. Monk smiled weakly. Wanted. It was worthless to him now. Recalling his youthful years, Monk raised the wine glass in his hand and raised it gently. Still, he is grateful to have met the 3 children who would later change his life. Nice to meet you, Fox. 1.3. Monk laughed and said that Fox had a happy expression in his eyes. When Monk was about to pay the bill, he quickly stood up and said, Mr. Kent, I will pay the bill. After saying this, he didn't give Monk a chance to refuse, and asked the waiter to hold out his business card. Monk raised his eyebrows and said, thank you. He then held out his hand to the other and said, your phone. Firefox froze for a moment, and handed over the phone with some difficulty. Monk entered his mobile number and said, goodbye, feel free to contact me if things don't go well. Fox carefully saved the number, then let out a long sigh of relief, and shouted to Monk's back, goodbye, Mr. Kent. Monk waved his hand. For the fried pork cutlet, Monk, who has nothing to do, decides to take a little time to save the other party when the story happens later. Advertisement. Chapter 568, The First Apprentice. Advertisement. Half a month later, after wreaking havoc in New York, Eric finally got his moniker Magneto. Later, he encounters a mutant who deliberately approaches him. After several days of getting along, Eric, who had already guessed the intention of the interlocutor, got his confirmation, and then under his leadership, he fell into the fire of hell and met the Black Queen. He was very capable and was immediately appreciated when he came to Hellfire. But being appreciated does not mean being reused, and he will reach his goal before long. And when Eric faced the Black Queen, his heart trembled when he saw this enchanting and charming woman whose whole body was infiltrated by chaos and evil. The opponent is very strong, and he must deal with it carefully. At the same time, Charles opened a school, and then used his identity as a doctor to start speaking in major universities to spread the knowledge of mutants. Although in class, he heard angry and sad whispers more than once, and even protested with insults, he was still very relieved to hear a different voice in his heart. And when Charles was asked if he was a mutant, he did not hesitate to admit his identity. Although it caused all his subsequent lectures to be cancelled, he was very confused, but if he didn't even dare to admit his identity, he wouldn't have to go this way. However, he didn't get nothing. He met a very gifted student. Jean Grey. To be precise, this girl is not a college student, but secretly came to the university auditorium to attend classes. She couldn't control her abilities, so after awakening her abilities at the age of 10, she didn't go to school. Fortunately, her parents loved her very much and did not treat her differently because she had awakened a supernatural power, which made her feel extremely happy. However, she still felt her parents' fear of her through her own ability. Not afraid of herself, but afraid of her ability, that is, afraid that she will sometimes hurt others because of her ability to lose control without knowing it. She has no choice but to suppress her ability, not even intending to use it. Before she meets Charles, a mutant doctor who generously confesses his identity. After class, Charles came to her quietly. After Charles found her, she showed her identity and purpose, hoping that Charles could help her. Advertisement. Without hesitation, Charles immediately agreed to accept him as his first apprentice. Jean Grey then went to find her parents with Charles. After persuading them to let her study with Charles, she came to the school that had not yet officially started. After Jean Grey looked around, marveling at the beauty of the school, Charles said, "This is our future school. A school for mutants." Jean Grey listened to what Charles said, with an expression of anticipation and excitement in her eyes. Charles nodded with a smile and said, "That's right. Very good." Jean Grey smiled, although she wanted to jump up and cheer, but her good family upbringing only made her clench her fist slightly. "You are a first-year student." Huh, ah. Jean Grey was stunned, not knowing what expression to make. Embarrassed, Charles turned his head aside and said, "Don't worry, things will get better." Jean Grey nodded. Go over there." Charles stretched out his hand and pointed to a small lake in the manor. After walking half a circle around the lake, he sat down on a bench more than 10 meters away from the lake. The bench was blocked by the branches and leaves of a big tree. "Sit down, Kettle." Charles patted the seat next to him. Jean Grey sat there gazing at the calm lake in front of her eyes, and the excitement in her heart gradually calmed down. Charles held out his hand to Jean, who hesitated. "Don't worry, everything is fine." Charles laughed. Jean Grey put her hand on Charles's and said, somewhat uncertainly, "Can I really control my strength?" "No one is born with control. A child learns to walk and often has to try many times. After we awaken our superpowers, we are like children who have just learned to walk. We need to keep trying, right?" Jean Grey nodded, but still worried. "But I can't control it. No matter how hard I try, it will hurt other people." "This girl is very kind." Advertisement. Charles looked at each other tenderly and said, "I'll help you." He held Jean Grey's hand tightly and said, "My father once told me that if you get the power, it proves that you are qualified to master it. All we have to do is to practice and then master it completely." He narrowed his eyes and grinned at Jean Grey. Sometimes you need a little help. Professor Charles, did you get some help, too? Jean Grey was curious. Charles smiled and said, yes, my father helped me until I got my strength. Jean Grey is a little envious, but not envious of this man having such a father, but envious of him being able to control his own power. Jin, let me see your strength. Jean Grey hesitated for a moment, but nodded, and began to show his strength, and Charles also began to use his own strength, carefully sensing the opponent's king of power. The next moment, Charles felt a spiritual force begin to flow into his mind. Is this 680, telepathic? Charles was surprised, even pleasantly surprised. He touched Jean Grey's spiritual power with his own spiritual power, and the two began to talk. Jean Grey was ecstatic. Although Charles had introduced his abilities to her when he visited the school, it was only when she knew that she was under the influence of Charles's psychic power that she realized how powerful the young man standing in front of her was. Powerful. The other side can help themselves. Thoughts, telepathy and powerful psychic powers. Jean Grey shows Charles her strength. Although the strength shown by Jean Grey is very good, but Charles is very clear that there is still a more powerful force hidden in the opponent's body. Charles told Jean Grey about his discovery, and Jean Grey was also a little puzzled. Pouting, Charles said, if you agree, I will touch this power with my own power. Jean Grey nodded without hesitation. She felt Charles's strength. Charles used his mind to explore this power, and when he came into contact with this power, his mind was shocked. This force is very powerful, surpassing his daughter-in-law. Before he could explore further, it turned out that this force was foolproof, and another force hidden in Jean Grey's mind was finally perceived by Charles. Advertisement. Chapter 560th Ix the so-called trap. Advertisement. Wow, what an arrogant little guy. The corners of Monk's eyes twitched. If there is an adult in front of him, he will definitely let him know what it means to have a fist that is too big, but a child of a few years old is not enough to bully a child unscrupulously. The little chubby girl snorted lightly, like a hamster that has won a battle, unable to raise her neck, turned and left the restaurant. Monk shook his head. It can't do without such a child. He sighed in his heart, stretched his legs, and when the other party turned to leave, he walked aside. At his feet, it was such a coincidence. Hey, it was such a coincidence that he reached the little fat girl's feet in an instant. Snapped. The little fat girl fell to the ground, froze, and let out a groan. Monk stood behind with Gwen in his arms, pretending he had nothing to do with him. The little chubby girl rolled around on the ground, pointed at Monk and screamed, "You bullied me." Monk blinked and said, "Son, figure it out, you stepped on me. You bullied me, you did it on purpose." The little fat girl screamed loudly, like a pig that has been taken away. What happened? At this time, the male teacher came over, looked at Monk, frowned and said to Monk, "As a parent, how can you do this? Aren't you talking nonsense, and aren't you blind now?" Monk said softly, "This B********* D has been in the cafeteria for so long, did he really not see anything before?" The male teacher glared at Monk and said, You, what are you? Are you worthy of being a teacher?" "I am willing to be. I'm going to the principal's office." Monk took the first step, carrying Gwen towards the principal's office. Seeing this scene, the male teacher was stunned for a moment, and strode after her. The little chubby girl got up from the ground with a grunt. "I'm going to sue you now, along with the principal's grandpa." Principal's office. Gwen looked at Monk with a little worry. Monk smiled and patted Gwen's head and said, "It's okay." After saying this, he turned and walked towards the principal. The headmaster's eyes flicked back and forth between the male teacher, the crying fat girl, and Monk. "That parent is you. There's nothing to say, the parents of the four parties are fast." Advertisement. Monk's tone is very light, he is better at communicating with parents. The principal has a headache. The parents of this little chubby girl are several shareholders of the school, and it will be even more difficult to deal with it at that time. The male teacher said, "I have already met teacher Peng Peiyu's parents, and her father will come soon." Hearing this, the principal was stunned for a moment, then turned his head and muttered, "Who told you to notify me? Peng Pei shareholders are troublesome." After a while, not only the parent will be unlucky, but the principal will also be unlucky. The male teacher said with a dry smile, "When there is a dispute, isn't it important for both parents to be present?" The principal glanced at the flattering teacher and said helplessly, "Then wait for Mr. Pompeo." Half an hour later, a man with a thick face and hair that had been waxed countless times, who wanted to write arrogance on his face, walked in and lit a cigar. "Dad." The little fat girl cried out in surprise, hugged the man, turned her head and stretched out her hand. She pointed at Monk and Gwen and said, "It's them." Breathing out a puff of smoke, Pompeo turned to the principal with a fierce look in his small eyes and said, "Get them out, call the police immediately, and have the police take him away. Tell them what he's plotting against the kids in the school." The principal laughed dryly and said, "It's not good to do that just among the kids." "Shut up," Peng Pai said coldly. "If you don't say anything, don't be that principal when you go back." The principal was silent, with a struggling expression on his face, while the male teacher next to him said, "I can be a witness." Peng Pai nodded in satisfaction, then turned to Monk and said, "Do you know what will happen to you?" Monk sighed. "I was not disappointed. Such parents can raise excellent children." Then he put Gwen on the ground and said to Gwen, "Go outside and wait for me." Gwen nodded and walked out of the room. Seeing this scene, Peng Peiao smiled coldly. Let a child go out on his knees and beg for mercy. This kind of thing happens to him often. Monk stood up, smiled at Yuan Peiyao, and when the principal and the male teacher looked at him dumbfounded, he swung his fist and hit Fat Pig on the chin. In an instant, the cigar mixed with the opponent's knocked-out teeth burst out of the rippling fat and flew into the air. Pompeo shook his head, took 2 steps back, and sat on the ground. You. The male teacher looked at Monk in horror. Monk sneered, stepped forward quickly, punched Dao Xin, let out a scream like a pig, and then looked back at the principal. The headmaster jerked back and forced a grin at Monk. Advertisement. Monk snorted softly, pushed his conversation partner's head down, and slammed it hard on the table, knocking him unconscious. Monk clapped his hands, looked at the dazed little chubby girl, grinned, took out his phone and pressed a number. The phone connected and Monk said, Oliver. I'm at Gwen's school and I'm in trouble. Quote dot. Backquote okay, I'll wait. After saying this, Monk hung up the phone and picked up a deck of cards. Name. Professor X. Character description. Powerful summoning ability. Note. Let's communicate from the heart. The playing cards disappeared, and a figure appeared behind Monk. It was a bald man sitting in a wheelchair, staring wisely ahead. The next second, when the black shadow turned into light spots and swept into Monk's body, Monk turned his gaze to Peng Pai. Such a person must have committed a lot of illegal and criminal acts, and we will hold the other party and Oliver accountable in the future. With a wave of his eyes, invisible spiritual power invaded the minds of the 3 people in the study. This force did not control them, nor did it change their memories, it just forced them to tell Oliver all about their illegal behavior when they met Oliver. And be honest when asked by other officers. After saying this, Monk opened the office door and walked out, and sat down with Gwen outside. Lee's Oliver came running in a few minutes later, relieved to see that Gwen was fine, and looked at Monk suspiciously. Monk gestured toward the office. Oliver walked in. 10 minutes later, Oliver came out with a blank face but he still couldn't help asking Monk, what happened? What's wrong? What happened to them? How did they admit to everything they did before for no reason? Who knows? They should have found out in their conscience. Monk shrugged and said, Can Gwen and I go? Oliver looked at Monk reproachfully and said, Go ahead and leave the rest to me. Compared with Yuan Bao's words, parents' quarrels are nothing compared to what Yuan Bao said. Thanks. Monk picked Gwen up. Oliver replied seriously. No, I should be thanked. He deserves a lot of credit. Thank you for what? Monk smiled and left with Gwen. Advertisement. Chapter 570. Experiment. Advertisement. Sending Gwen out of the school gate. Before Monk could speak, Gwen bowed her head and said, I'm sorry. Sorry. Why are you sorry? Monk looked at Gwen. Gwen bowed her head further and said, I'm the reason you're in trouble. Trouble, Meng said with a smile. Sometimes troubles come to you, and. Monk squinted at Gwen and said, It's not a problem at all for me. Gwen looked up at Monk, saw that Monk was not angry, and let out a long sigh. Monk stroked Gwen's head and suddenly said, What did you call me when you quarreled with that little fat man? Gwen raised her head and said in a panic, I won't dare to destroy it anymore. Monk didn't let her call her daddy, she thought Monk didn't like her being called daddy. Call me that again, I like it. Ah, Gwen looked at Monk in surprise as her eyes turned red when she saw him looking at her tenderly, and whispered, Daddy. Ha ha. Monk smiled happily, held Gwen in his arms, kissed her little cheek and said, You finally called me. Gwen smiled and kissed Monk's face, and then called out affectionately, Daddy. Ha ha. Monk smiled happily, touched Gwen and said, let's go home. Looking back at the school, Monk snorted softly. 993. What a lousy school if there are such teachers. Let Gwen transfer next semester, they won't come to this bad school, and the end of the semester is only a few days away. Speaking of which, Christmas is almost here. Monk propped his chin on his hand, thinking about how to spend this Christmas. After all, this is the first time Gwen has spent Christmas with him. X Academy. Hank McCoy was sitting at the table in the room, writing, drawing, and modifying some drawings. There was a knock on the door. Hank McCoy stopped what he was doing, gestured, put his forehead against the door, and murmured, Come in. Come in. The door flung open and Charles walked in. Hank. Advertisement. Charles called his companion, walked over to him, leaned gently on his desk. How are you? He asked. Hank McCoy grumbled. You think it's easy. You still have to have room to stand it up. By the way, I've been using Chase lately. Charles thought for a moment and said, How about we put it underground? Under the school. Bea, Hank McCoy thought for a while and said, Maybe, but it would take a lot of work to build it underground. Quote. Charles thought for a while and said, Leave it to me, you can figure out a way down there. No problem. Hank McCoy nodded, but then said with a smile, Although the final design is not completed, I have made a miniature brain according to the concept we discussed earlier. Miniature. That's right, Hank McCoy said with some excitement. If it works, then our idea will work, and I'll move on to the final design. If it doesn't work, then there's no need for me to continue. Charles nodded and asked doubtfully, Is it fair? Seeing Hank McCoy looking at him strangely, Charles froze. What Go try it. Hank McCoy rubbed his hands, and Charles was slightly taken aback by the look of his eyes shining. Go. Hank McCoy grabs Charles by the arm. Go and try. When it comes to experiments, he is always so cheerful. Moments later, they reached the top of the building, and Charles saw the miniature brain in Hank McCoy's mouth. This is a small radar I made before, and I modified it into the current brain. Hank McCoy picked up a helmet with many antennas and put it on Charles's head. This humanoid radar can be said to be miniaturized. I did it in a hurry, but the function is the same, so there shouldn't be any problems. Rush. Should. Charles gave Hank McCoy a hard look, forced a smile and said, let's wait until you're sure. It's not too late, I'll use my brain. Before Charles could finish speaking, Hank McCoy, whose hands were faster than his mouth, turned on his brain and said to Charles, use your abilities. Charles was taken aback for a moment, and cooperated with the other party attentively. In an instant, he felt that his perception range expanded rapidly, and one person after another appeared in his mind. A few seconds later, Hank McCoy turned off his brain, looked at the dumbfounded Charles, and asked nervously, how is it? Charles wrinkled the corners of his mouth, saliva dripped from the corners of his mouth, and his eyeballs began to move wildly. Nothing wrong here. Hank McCoy was stunned, and his face paled instantly. Advertisement. Ha ha ha. Charles burst out laughing, hugged Hank McCoy tightly, and said, Hank, you're such a genius. Hank McCoy groaned, slapped Charles hard twice, and said, you're an A***** hole. This frightened him. Charles paled, let go of his interlocutor, and said, come on, let's drop everything, we gotta get ready for Christmas, Jean and Aurora are waiting for us, let's go shopping first. Hank McCoy raised his glasses, smiled and nodded. Christmas tree, Christmas stocking, garland of colorful light bulbs. Monk brought home all kinds of Christmas items and was busy taking care of Gwen. Dad, drink some water. Gwen brought Monk a glass of water. Monk took it, smiling like a flower. The daughter is so cute. What gift does Gwen want? Monk asked casually. Gwen shook her head thoughtfully, hugged Monk and said, I like whatever Daddy gives me. Look what a daughter. What a daughter. So cute and relatable. If it was Clark and the others, there must be a lot of discussion now. Thinking of those three people, Monk sighed. Don't know what they are doing now. Dad, Monk looked at Gwen and said, I forgot to tell you you have a brother. Younger brother. Gwen blinked and replied, as there. Why didn't I know? You'll see later, right now they have other things to do. Gwen nodded, looking forward to it, but also worried. What if they don't like me? No, Monk said with certainty. They will like me, and if they don't, I'll throw them out. Gwen giggled and responded, no, that's not right. Squeezing Gwen's little face, Monk put the water glass aside and said, let's get down to business. Let's get down to business. I'll help Dad. Gwen raised her hand. Advertisement. Chapter 571 Crazy Christmas Eve. Advertisement. Christmas is just around the corner and with it comes the festive spirit. But in the afternoon of Christmas Eve, something beyond imagination happened. A video clip appeared on the internet and quickly became popular. In the video, the president's wife and daughter scream in horror and cry that they have been kidnapped. People thought it was fake at first, but were surprised to find that the abduction video was sent through the social media accounts of the president's wife and daughter. The president's wife and daughter are both celebrities on social media. Once the kidnapping video was exposed, it went viral almost immediately at an exaggerated speed. What is shocking is not only the kidnapping of the president's wife and daughter, but also the strange demands of the kidnappers. The kidnappers want the president to perform a live performance at the Christmas Eve chimes and interact with a pig during the performance. At the end of the video, the kidnapper said that if he could be fooled by special effects or other means, he would kill the hostages directly after being seen by someone with computer technology from Grandmaster. Although the angry president has started to delete this video from the internet, and even banned media reports after the video was exposed, it has no effect, and the video has spread like a virus in the hands of people. People talked wildly, and some unscrupulous media began to exaggerate, and all eyes were focused on this story. At this time, the angry president lost his temper in the White House. There are so many people, can't find one of them. Your Excellency, the kidnappers are very professional and internet experts. We have checked the IP address of the video release, and it is a fake address of the organization. Even after we exposed the fake address. And after sending someone there, they couldn't find it. Quote. Stop all that crap, I'm just asking if I can find it. Sorry, we need some time, and since. Damn, nonsense. The president slammed the table and looked at the rest of the cabinet with red eyes like an enraged bull. He could imagine the mood of these people, and even the mood of all those who watched this ridiculous farce. Are there many people who want to watch a good show? Just thinking about it, he wants to take out that black box that can destroy the world. Your Excellency, Tony Stark is on vacation, but Stark Industries' cybersecurity department is helping us find it ourselves. Vacation. Vacation. The president replied angrily. Call him for me and let him come back. His mobile phone is turned off, and he cannot be reached. The president took a deep breath, clenched his fist, and knocked on the table with a gavel. Where is S.H.I.E.L.D.? What did they find? They're also trying to find it. Advertisement. Look carefully. Look carefully. Look carefully. The FBI was looking, the CIA was looking, and the king's security was with me. But you helped me find him. A bunch of waste. The president took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. He looked at the dignitaries in the room, and suddenly felt that the chair under his buttocks was burning like a volcano, and he would be burned to ashes at any moment. People pull out. Give up. His image as a good husband and a good father has been supported by many people during the past 2 years of his presidency. If he does, his image will collapse. Not only will he lose his daughter and wife, but eventually as a result, they will lose public opinion, be unable to keep their positions, and lose power and family. So what? Although the image has been restored, it has become a laughingstock. It is unknown whether he can keep his official position, because it is impossible for people to let a person who is with a pig continue to manage the country. However, it might save his wife and daughter. This is a dilemma. There are cliffs on both sides, and he is like a lone boat on the sea, which will capsize at any time and be swallowed mercilessly. Who is this person? How did his family get kidnapped? Are these bodyguards really all idiots? He slammed the hammer on the table again. How to choose? Some people in the office are hesitant to speak, some are secretly laughing, some are worried. Finally, the president took a deep breath and said, "Don't give up looking, get ready." The hearts of the attendees trembled as they realized what this so-called preparation represented. The president is ready to explode. The president trembled and closed his eyes, waved his hands and said, "Everyone go downstairs, if you have any news, please let me know." Everyone got up and left quickly. As the crowd left, he covered his eyes and cried bitterly. He loves his family very much. Monk was also shocked when he saw the news. Zero seeking flowers. This kidnapper is a talent. Advertisement. So fun. The world is still crazy. Immediately afterwards, his expression became weird. However, for Charles, this seems like a good opportunity, doesn't it? In fact, Charles and Nick Fury thought so too. As soon as the incident happened, Nick Fury contacted Charles, and the two met quietly. Do you have any ideas? If so, it will be of great benefit to you in the construction of X school. Nick Fury looked at Charles with a look of anticipation in his eyes. Charles hesitated and said, "I can try." After saying this, he turned to Nick Fury. "Can you solve it with S.H.I.E.L.D.? Who knows?" Nick Fury said lightly. "They're already looking for him, just take it as a try." Charles nodded and said, "Come with me, I need something to find someone." Nick Fury smiled. They left the office, and Charles turned to Hank McCoy, who was waiting outside, and said, "Hank, this time I'm counting on your EG machine." After discussion, they decided to name the brain a brainwave machine. Brainwave machine. Nick Fury blinked, feeling a little curious. Hank McCoy nodded excitedly and walked briskly away. Chin and Aurora glanced at him and followed closely behind. After the group of five reached the roof, Charles put on a somewhat crude brainwave helmet. Although the range of his electroencephalogram is only a few hundred kilometers, since the hostages are missing, the kidnappers should not have taken the hostages far, and they should be within the range of his electroencephalogram. The brain waves were sent to Washington. Hank McCoy interrupts Nick Fury. Quiet. Charles nodded to everyone, and used his ability after turning on the brainwave device. Perception expanded, concentrated on him, and spread to great distances, then perception expanded. Charles closed his eyes as the thought of a perceived person flashed through his mind. The others looked at him anxiously and expectantly. After a while, Charles opened his eyes, grinned, and said, "I found it, I found it." Advertisement. Chapter 572 Countdown. Advertisement. A period of time has passed, the world-famous kidnapping case is still going on, and the president's wife and daughter have not been rescued, which also means that the series is getting closer and closer. Some people are sad about it, some people are indignant about it, but there are also many people who are happy and looking forward to it. It's a tragedy, but not everyone sees it that way. The kidnapper is a genius, but he won't just disappear into this world. Thanks to such a monstrous search, clues were finally found. Unfortunately, this is a trap deliberately left by the kidnappers, and this trap has been set for a long time. Over the ensuing hours, several more locations were discovered, but they all turned out to be smoke bombs thrown by the kidnappers. The president began to lose patience, and even felt that his soul was flying out of his body, the whole world began to distort, and he himself was becoming a puppet in 543. The venue for the live broadcast is ready, but this is the worst-case scenario and the last chance. At the same time, the night that should have celebrated the arrival of Christmas was extremely silent. Except for the children who occasionally ran past, everyone was staring at the TV intently. Christmas Eve will be different this year. The 5-minute countdown began, and the president walked into the studio in a cold sweat under the gaze of everyone. Everything is ready. His partner was also sedated and passed a check to make sure no harm could be done to him. The cameraman is already in place, and the live broadcast equipment has also been turned on. He has also started preparing. His wife, daughter, plus his driver's license. When everything was ready, he decided to fight back. His dignity was reduced to ashes as pieces of clothing flew from him. Of course, there's some good news. His approval ratings have unexpectedly surged, according to an internet poll, the highest ever for past presidents. It was the only thing that comforted him. Meanwhile, with the 5 minutes counting down, Charles and Nick Fury made their move. More precisely, they had found their target long ago, but they were just waiting for the countdown, waiting for the president to accept his tragic fate, waiting for the moment when he stepped into the abyss, and then pulled him from the other side come out. When the time came, the president who had resigned himself to his fate was suddenly rescued. The gratitude and joy generated by this grand scene of falling from a height far exceeded the effect achieved by rescuing the other party an hour ago. That's Nick Fury's suggestion. Advertisement. He said, anyway, it is inevitable for the other party to make a fool of himself, and he can take this opportunity to make himself better. There are always presidents, but such opportunities are rare. There is no doubt that after this incident, Charles, as the main instigator, is very likely to receive at least as much support from the president on the issue of X school, and the resistance will be much smaller. Even if the details of the incident are made public, Charles will remain a hero in the eyes of many for saving the hapless president. Action. Watching the clock count down 2 minutes, Nick Fury turned to Charles. He also had to set aside time to call the White House. Charles nodded. It was just him and Nick Fury in this operation. The next second, Charles raised his hand, pressed his fingers on his temple, and said to Nick Fury, "Here." Nick Fury, who had no time to catch his breath, was stunned and asked, "That's it?" Charles nodded and said, "Contact the other party, we will rescue them." Nick Fury pulls out his phone and says, "No problem." After saying these words, they walked towards the building. Nick Fury looked at his watch and pressed a number after the 60-second countdown. At the same time, apart from the president and his partner, only the cameraman and the president's secret were left in the broadcasting room. 1 minute left. The live broadcast is about to begin. The president looked at the screen sadly and said, "For the sake of my family, I am willing to sacrifice myself, and this is my promise to each of you." He walked forward slowly, his whole body trembling slightly. Getting closer. Getting closer. Suddenly, he closed his eyes tightly, clenched his teeth, ready to give everything, even bent down. "Stop! Stop!" The secretary yelled with joy, rushed straight to the bewildered president, pulled him aside, grabbed his jacket around his waist, and shouted to the president, "Sir! Saved! Saved! It's all right." The president was stunned, his body suddenly went limp, and he sat down on his belly button, then jumped up with a blushing face, and shouted to the camera, "Cheers to our great motherland." In this way, the feeling of falling from the most powerful position in the world to hell, and from hell to heaven arises spontaneously. There were cheers from the auditorium, but many people seemed disappointed because they didn't see what they wanted to see. Advertisement. Even so, the president was saved. He put on his clothes with a flushed face, hugged everyone and walked out of the studio. This time, not only did he not lose face, but he won more support, and he will have a place in vice admiral in the next election. He immediately thought of the next election. A group of people walked into the Oval Office of the president. The president was still immersed in the excitement just now, and kept pacing up and down. Who saved my wife and daughter?" He stood up and asked the secretary excitedly. "Yes. What is it?" "It's a mutant." "Mutant." The president stood up. "Yes, sir, that's exactly what Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Nick Fury reported. S.H.I.E.L.D. Aren't they responsible?" "No, only 2 people participated in this operation, Nick Fury and the mutant named Charles who saved your family." After a pause, the secretary said, "That's what Nick Fury reported." 1.0 Nick Fury. That B********** D won't give it, so he was really saved by the mutant this time. Long live mutants. He couldn't help but let out a sigh inwardly. Charles, isn't his name Charles? I want to see him. Right away. They're coming with your family and they'll be there in a few minutes. The president nodded, then frowned. Soon. What do you mean? Where did they find it? Hearing this question, the secretary blushed strangely and replied, "It's only 5 blocks from here." As soon as the voice fell, the office suddenly fell into silence, and the president's face became extremely ugly, and he couldn't help but cursed at everyone. A bunch of idiots. Advertisement. Chapter 573 Graduation Party. Advertisement. Charles and Nick Fury sent the family and the kidnappers to the White House. And when they arrived, several media outlets had already been waiting at the door and had already been warned. Seeing this situation, Charles glanced at Nick Fury who was sitting behind the steering wheel. Nick Fury rolled his eyes and sat motionless, seemingly having nothing to do with him. However, it is a good thing to be in the media, and it is also a very good thing for him, a life-saving hero. "Get out of the car," Nick Fury said softly and stopped the car. He ran to the co-pilot and opened the car door for the president's wife who was sitting on the co-pilot. The president's wife originally wanted to tidy up her clothes, but when she thought about it, she got out of the car. The moment she got out of the car, there were tears in the corners of her eyes. Charles opened the car door, smiled at the president's daughter who was staring at him, and said, "Get out of the car, beautiful lady." The president's daughter blushed, nodded to Charles's outstretched hand, and got out of the car under the flashing lights. The security guard stopped the reporters and even started to drive them away. Seeing this scene, the first lady waved her hand, wiped away her tears, and said, "They are all just worried about us, let them ask, but I am very confused now, I am afraid there are many questions I can't even answer." She smiled firmly. When the reporters heard each other's words, 10 of them jumped up energetically and began to question the 3 of them. During this period, the president's wife and daughter were full of praise for Charles. As for Nick Fury, after getting out of the car, he mingled with the guards and took away the kidnapper, who was thrown into the trunk, but was still unconscious. The president's wife and daughter answered a few questions before heading to the White House, while interested reporters were stopped by security. Although they could not directly interview the victims, these reporters did not intend to leave. On the contrary, after a period of time, the reporters continued to come. They want to get first-hand information. Throughout the night, the White House was very lively, with a Christmas atmosphere. After midnight, the news finally came. A press conference will be held at 9 o'clock in the morning to explain the incident in detail, and the conference will be broadcast live, but only invited journalists will be admitted. Upon hearing the news, the reporters hurriedly called their superiors, hoping to get tickets to the press conference. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and the group of reporters got impatient. The press conference started on time. The president attended the press conference with his family. All three of them were well dressed, but their tired faces were hard to hide. The three answered some questions from the reporters and expressed their gratitude to Charles and Shield. In particular, Charles also accepted the three people's grand thanks. Seeing this scene, the reporters couldn't help being curious about Charles standing beside him. Advertisement. The question continues as more and more details of the incident emerge. For example, supporting the fact that Charles is a mutant is the fact that he can save the president's family this time. Hearing the news, the audience was stunned, and then in the questioning session, the reporters raised their hands to ask Charles. To these questions, Charles just answered with a smile. Abilities are not good or bad, it all depends on how the owner uses them. Everyone has the ability to choose their lives, and mutants also have the ability to choose. Please treat mutants with tolerance, so that way there will be more and more mutants coming out, using their abilities for good. That was what he said last night after consulting with the president and getting permission. Apparently, after that incident, he impressed the president, otherwise mutants would never have had the chance to be on the launch pad, let alone speak. These were the only words Charles said throughout the meeting, but reporters occasionally looked at Charles, apparently daring to interview him after the meeting. Eventually, the entire kidnapping process and Bang's identity are revealed. The process of kidnapping is not uncommon, but after learning the identity of the kidnapper, everyone accepted this fact. He used to be the bodyguard of the president's house and knew everything about the president's house. Not only that, but the other party also has network technology, computer technology, and even an elite special forces soldier. Being the president's bodyguard is also part of the other party's kidnapping plan. The other party's kidnapping was premeditated, and even prepared for a whole year, because in order to. The kidnapper claimed to be an artist. The press conference was over, but several reporters did not leave. When they saw Charles coming out, they immediately surrounded him. In this regard, Charles patiently answered one question after another. He knew he was one step closer to his goal, and a very big one at that. Turning off the TV, Monk couldn't help laughing when he thought of Charles standing on the podium just now. How delightful that is. Elegant and dignified, he gets an 8 for true heritage. He is well groomed. Monk was secretly proud, seeing Gwen looking at him curiously, blushing, and said, "Gwen, what do you want to eat? Gwen, what do you want for lunch? Do you want to go out to eat?" "Going out," Gwen said, looking at him in disgust. "It's too bad to eat out. I want to eat Daddy's food." "No problem." Monk smiled, looked at the time and said, "Let's go shopping with me." Gwen nodded, ran back to the room, changed out of her loose vacation clothes, put on her weekend clothes, put on a hat, and tied a scarf with a kitten doll hanging on it, then ran out of the room, turned to Monk and said, "Daddy, I'll change out of clothes." Monk nodded and walked towards the door. Gwen looked at Monk and shook her head. "Dad." Advertisement. She ran into Monk's bedroom, opened the closet, picked up the gloves they bought together, and ran out dragging the scarf. "Dad, I'll tie it for you." Gwen picked up the same scarf. Monk gave Gwen an approving look, then sat down. Gwen tied Monk's scarf, pinned the kitten doll to the bottom of the scarf, and stepped back, nodding with a frown. 383. "I recommend it. Tie him up." She smiled happily and handed the gloves to Monk. Monk patted Gwen's nose with a smile, adjusted his hat, and the father and daughter opened the door and walked out. The father and daughter took Gwen's hand and walked to the supermarket not far from home. Perhaps because yesterday's Christmas Eve was too peaceful, today's Christmas seems to be much more lively than in previous years. People coming and going on the street made Gwen look sideways slightly. "Girl, this is for you." Before entering the supermarket, a supermarket employee dressed as Santa Claus handed Gwen a candy that looked like a Christmas tree. Gwen blinked and said affectionately to Santa, "Thank you, Grandpa, but can I have another one?" "Okay, little girl." Seeing how cute the little guy is, Santa Claus took out another candy and gave it to Gwen. Gwen smiled happily, said, "Thank you," politely, and pulled Monk into the depths of the supermarket. She stuffed one candy into her mouth and gnawed, then carefully tore off the wrapper of another candy, turned around and handed it to Monk, saying, "Daddy, this is for you." Monk took it and put it in his mouth. "My daughter is so cute." "Dad, is it delicious? Tasty? Sweet or not? Let's eat some later." Advertisement. Chapter 574 Cooking. Advertisement. On the way home from the supermarket, Gwen held a small bag of candy, took Monk's hand, and sprinted without paying attention to her feet. Well, Gwen jerked and fell forward. Monk pulled down, saving Gwen from falling into little Heineke's stomach. Gwen looked at Monk's reproachful eyes, shook her little hand and said, "It's okay, it's okay." As he spoke, he gave Monk a crooked smile and stuck out his tongue. Monk shook his head with a smile and just picked Gwen up. Heck, now that Gwen is over 6, almost too old to be hugged, she needs to take the opportunity to cuddle more. Monk thought blankly. Holding Gwen in one hand, and a large bag of ingredients in the other, the father and daughter have tall facial features, walking on the street, their image is very eye-catching. Just as they were about to go home, an unexpected acquaintance was waiting for them. Fox, carrying a bag in his hand, walked across from them. Monk stopped. "Fox, Mr. Kent." Fox yelled in surprise, hurriedly stubbed out the cigarette in his hand, threw it into his carry-on bag, and looked at Mengdu with a smile. Do you live near here? Monk asked a little puzzled. Fox shook his head and said, I'm here to do something. Her eyes turned to Gwen, and Gwen was looking at her curiously. She imitated her superior image and made a face at Gwen, which made Gwen giggle. Fox smiled at Monk and said, Is this your daughter, Mr. Kent? That's right. Monk stroked Gwen's head lovingly. Fox looked at Gwen with some envy, noticed that Monk was holding a few things in his hand, and hurriedly said, I won't hinder you. Said, turned sideways. Sister, come eat with us. Suddenly, Gwen extended an invitation to Fox. Fox was puzzled, but also moved. This is the goal I pursue, and even an opportunity to eat with my idol, and the idol cooks for me. Looking at Monk carefully, remembering his identity, Fox sighed listlessly, and said with difficulty, Van. Sister, my dad's cooking skills are very good. Gwen wrinkled her big eyes and extended the invitation again. Seeing that Gwen liked Fox so much, Monk could only say, then let's go. Fox was very pleasantly surprised. Is it really possible? Advertisement. Let's go. Monk raised the bag in his hand and said, I bought a lot of things. Fox said cheerfully, I'll get it. Monk laughed and said, no. Dad, put me down. Gwen whispered in Monk's ear, and after Monk put her on the ground, he took Fox's hand. Come on, sister. Fox looked at Monk and praised, Mr. Kent, your daughter is so lovely. Monk nodded silently. She is indeed cute. Gwen urges, Dad, let's go. I'm starving. As he spoke, he pulled Fox towards the direction of the house. With one more person, the journey became quite lively. After arriving home, Lu Wenxiang gave Fox a pair of slippers. Fox froze. Monk turned his head to look and said, change it, it will be more comfortable. Fox looked at his high heels with a smile on his lips. They are so delicate. Would you like something to drink? Fox said a little nervously, water will do. Monk nodded and poured a glass of water. Gwen ran over to take the water glass and said, I'll come, Dad is going to cook. Monk smiled and patted Gwen on the head. Hey, Gwen smiled, poured Fox some water, took off his hat and scarf, and ran into the bedroom. Holding the hot water in his hand, Fox felt the intoxicating warmth spread from his palm to the bottom of his heart, and couldn't help laughing. She has always regarded Monk as her idol and her goal, but she never thought that one day she would be able to eat the dishes made by her idol. It's like picking up a lottery ticket on the road and realizing you've won the jackpot. Gwen took off her hat and scarf, washed her hands, and ran out with more sweets, handing Fox more fruit. Okay, you don't have to take care of me anymore. Seeing Gwen busy like a bee, Fox expressed sympathy for her. Gwen handed over the candy and said, Sister, eat candy. Fox asked puzzled. This is something she hasn't experienced in a long time. She took a bite, tore off the wrapping paper, took a bite, stretched out a finger, pushed the sugar into her mouth, and slightly narrowed her eyes full of taste. So sweet. Is it tasty? Gwen blinked. Advertisement. Fox nodded. It's my favorite flavor, said Gwen cheerfully. Fox smiled. Your name is Gwen, right? Yes. Gwen nodded and said, You are beautiful, sister. Fox was happier. Two people, one big and one small, were muttering something. Wife. What a strange creature. No matter how much, no matter how big or small, can talk. Monk sighed, shook his head, and closed the kitchen door. A map appeared in his hand. Name. Lu Angson. Character introduction. The heir of the Kikushita family, with extremely high cooking talent, the youngest summoning chef. Remarks. Cooking is human happiness. Christmas is coming, Monk decided to eat something delicious. Here's a deck he made last night. Thinking about it, the playing cards scattered into spots of light, and a shadow appeared behind Monk. It is worthy of being an ordinary dish. Monk screamed, put the rice on the table, and turned to Fox. Longuo cuisine, can you? As she approached the kitchen, she took 2 plates of food from Monk, sniffed it, and to her surprise, it made her swallow it completely incomprehensibly. Gwen took a sip and said, today's dishes seem to be even more delicious. The black shadow only appeared for a while before it turned into a spot of light and swept over Monk's body. Gwen, it's time to eat. Fox rubbed Gwen's head and said, I'll help. Although these dishes are considered ordinary in Lu Angson's eyes, they are still a bit exaggerated for ordinary people. Monk sighed, and took out the dish. The tempting aroma immediately attracted the attention of the 2 people. It was a young man wearing a red turban and a vest of the same color. He was bent over, with a straight face, and he clenched his fists in salute. Looking at the 5 dishes and 1 soup in front of him, Monk patted his forehead. Too delicious. Almost instantly, a formula appeared in his mind, and then his saliva rolled quickly. Looks even better than the chef's. Quote. As expected of a person in the food industry. Fox nodded. Monk looked at the washed ingredients, grinned meaningfully, and picked up the turntable. Monk knows how to cook quickly, and in no time another dish is ready. Advertisement. Chapter 576, Acid. Advertisement. Ah chew. Clark sneered. Who is thinking about him? He shook his head, looking helplessly at the wolf biting lion on his arm. Dude, have you had enough fun? The lion grabbed Clark's motionless hand and shook his head vigorously. With a little effort, Clark pulled his hand out of the lion's mouth, looked at the saliva on it, and while the lion was backing away, gently pinched it with one hand, pressed it to the ground, and wiped the saliva on the lion's mane. At the same time as it let out a whimper, it let go of the poor and expensive handcloth. The male lion ran away, followed by several female lions, looking at Clark in horror. Clark grinned meaningfully, and hastily took out his camera to take pictures. Under the night sky, the lions looked around in horror, as if they saw something terrible. This photo is very interesting. Clark nodded in satisfaction, put away the camera, turned and returned to the tent. Christmas is over, and the Japanese army is coming to an end. At the end of the year, Monk took Gwen to New York to watch the school for half a month. After Gwen's choice, he decided to change schools. After helping Gwen with the transfer paperwork, all that's left is to wait for the new semester to start so she can transfer to her new school. Calculating the time, there is only 1 week until the start of the new semester. Gwen has excellent academic performance. In order to have good educational conditions, Monk plans to settle in New York for a long time, and cancels the plan to return to the farm. As for the farm, it is impossible to sell it. After all, there are too many good memories there, so he plans to hand over the farm to Bob. Now that he has decided to stay in New York for a long time, after careful consideration, he decides to live in another place, preferably closer to Gwen's new school. The school is located in Queens. Thinking of this, it suddenly occurred to him that he had several properties in Queens. Take a few minutes to look at the real estate certificate, and then pick a suitable place. Monk muttered softly, "Dad." Gwen clenched the chopsticks into fists, squeezed the food on the plate with difficulty, and asked curiously, "What are you thinking?" Monk dropped a piece of crispy roast tenderloin into Gwen's bowl and said, "One wonder where we're going to move." Move place. Gwen put the tenderloin in her mouth and began to chew, watching Monk with wide eyes. "Yeah, it's closer to your new school." Gwen tilted her head and said, "The new school I chose is so troublesome, why don't I choose a new school?" "No problem." Monk waved his hand and said, "Buy the furniture, just go in." Gwen nodded, raised her chopsticks to pick up the meatballs on the plate. Advertisement. In an instant, the extremely resilient meatballs jumped out of the plate and bounced twice on the table, as if mocking Gwen. Gwen. Monk. Ha ha ha. He couldn't help laughing a few times, coughing a few times. Gwen looked at him desperately and said, "I'll teach you." Uh-huh. Gwen nodded, but reached up and bit a pill into her mouth, then snorted and looked at Monk, who was staring at her. Monk shook his head helplessly, held Gwen's hand, and taught him how to use chopsticks. Gwen got serious and started fiddling with the plate in front of her. "You won't stop until you learn." Monk nodded expressionlessly. Gwen's little ability is really like that of their Kent family. Suddenly, a pleasant bell rang. Monk looked at it, raising his eyebrows. Charles. This guy hasn't contacted him for a long time. Picking up the phone slowly, before Monk had time to say anything, Charles complained, "Dad, why are you so slow to answer the phone this time? You used to answer in seconds." "Oh, at dinner time. Eat. With whom?" Charles asked curiously, and then couldn't help but say, "I want to eat hot pot. I want to eat hot pot." "Then come over when you are free." Charles has much less to worry about than Eric. "Hey." Charles smiled and said suddenly, "You haven't told me who you're having dinner with." "And Gwen." Gwen. Hearing this, Charles immediately straightened up, with the fire of 8 trigrams shining in his eyes. "Well, my daughter." "Oh, it turned out to be a female daughter." Charles screamed and jumped up on the spot. "When did you have a daughter? Why didn't I know? Didn't I tell you?" Monk was puzzled. Charles felt relieved, and he said, "Dad, you have changed and you have forgotten me." Monk said impatiently, "You are such a big man, why cry? It's okay. If it's okay, I'll hang up the phone." 0 looking for flowers. Charles. Advertisement. To his next shock, Monk actually hung up the phone. Charles. Cheng hung up on him. He gritted his teeth and called again, and when he connected, he said angrily, "Dad, how could you do this to me? What did I do to you?" Monk couldn't bear it any longer, and replied, "How the hell is this?" Charles squeezed his aching heart and said, "Dad, I need your help." "Help. That's right." Charles hesitated. "I want to open up the underground space under the school." "You want me to dig holes?" "Well, I know Dad must have a way." There was a tinge of pleasure in Charles's voice. 0. Monk thought for a while and replied, "Let's wait a few days, I don't have time recently." "Huh?" Charles asked warily, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to move to New York permanently, I'm moving." "Wait," Charles said hurriedly, "I want to go home for dinner. I want sweet and sour dumplings and stewed fish." "Charles, come back after I finish eating." Because he is on a dangerous mission, his identity must be kept secret until he succeeds. Monk didn't hear the voice on the other end of the phone. He said, "I'll call you when I'm ready." Monk smiled and stroked Gwen's head. Gwen's eyes lit up. She nodded solemnly and said, "I know, it's our secret. Why didn't you have this plan when the 3 of us were in school?" Monk hung up the phone coldly. "You are so big, you still eat and eat all day long." Gwen blinked and asked, "Dad, was brother on the phone just now?" "Gwen, what do you want for dinner tonight?" Gwen nodded without hesitation, and then asked suspiciously, "Why?" "It's none of your business, is it, daughter?" Monk nodded and said to Gwen, "That brother will come over in a few days, but you have to keep it secret. You can't tell others that he is your brother, you know." Monk turned to Gwen amiably. "Well." Monk looked at Gwen approvingly and said, "New York has better educational facilities and I want to move closer to their school." Agent. Advertisement.